I'm here with my friend Kay. We're going to do another talk today, and we're going to do a talk about William Blake, the poet, painter, engraver, nonconformist. There's probably many other things we can say about him. Now, Kay brought up the idea of sort of going into Blake. Recently, I had a talk with my friend Aron about the book of Job, and we were looking at that, and throughout that video, and I'll put a link to the link in the description, but throughout that video we used images created by William Blake illustrating Job. And so I was talking to Kay about this, and he mentioned that he loves Blake, basically. And so I hadn't read much Blake at all, so he convinced me to read some more, and specifically today we'll be talking about The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So this is a relatively early work by Blake, and Blake lived basically in the second half of the 18th century, first half of the 19th century. He's considered maybe a proto-romantic, so maybe not quite a romantic poet, but certainly someone who preempted or maybe even kicked off the movement. And he's a very interesting character. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself by going into why, but very kind of individualistic and unique, visionary. And so this work that we're talking about today, it's what would you say, an illustrated kind of poetic, philosophical tome, manifesto, maybe?
I would probably go with manifesto.
Manifesto, yeah. An early manifesto of William Blake, one of his more famous works. And so we both read it, in the case of Kay, reread it, and we're going to just talk about it today. So it's going to be a relatively unstructured kind of discussion or dialogue, and we'll just see where it takes us. So first of all, Kay, like what are some reasons that you love Blake? Why is he so important?
Well, like I was saying to you just before we kicked it off, I think primarily what draws me in is Blake's aesthetics. There's just something in his use of language and also imagery which appeals to me, and a lot of people, obviously. And I don't know, I like free spirits, and I just always seem to be attracted to ambiguities, contraries, and the mixing of kind of gentleness and violence, or kindness and cruelty.
Kindness and cruelty, yeah, those contraries. I mean, when you say contraries, I'm thinking of his collection of poetry, Songs of Innocence and Experience. So there's a contrary there. And I was saying to you just before we started this conversation that for me, I'd never really got into Blake, because even though I actually loved the other romantic poets, particularly people like Shelley and Keats, I never really got into Blake because something was sort of just a bit off-putting about his poetry. And I think it's down to this kind of saccharine quality, this kind of sweetness and simplicity that you see in some of the poems from Songs of Innocence and Experience. But you were telling me you actually see that as a virtue, as something that's attractive.
Yeah, I like the almost childishness of it sometimes. I like the commonness, like the use of what for his context would be a kind of universal language, heavily biblical.
Sort of like, is he appealing to just like the masses? Everyone can understand this, everyone can read and enjoy this? Or would you not go that far?
Well, I think that's an aspect of it, but I think that there's a kind of, even in the what appear to be the really saccharine kind of works, I think there's something a little bit sinister about it, knowing his full context and knowing how he pairs them, and there's something almost sickly or problematizing. I like the kind of I think in the kind of punk aesthetic, you get that as well.
Mm-hmm.
You get things which are on the surface, it's like
Simple.
well, in music, it's like power pop or whatever,
Yes.
But there's something lurking under that,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Blake does that quite well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we when we were talking before, you mentioned the example, and I can't remember the exact wording of the poem, but you mentioned the example of that poem that he has about the rose and the worm.
Yeah, I just
The worm that flies.
because it's such a short and simple poem, and there's obviously there's a kind of superficial interpretation where the rose is just kind of a rose is like a wholly good thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, like the rose has a parasite. But well, yeah, when I was correcting you on it's not a fly or anything. It's a worm that flies in the storm. Which
Yes.
I think the weirdness combined with the simple, accessible language.
Yes.
I find that quite appealing, and it's quite punk rock in a way.
There's something profoundly perverse or disturbing about this
Yes.
idea of a worm that flies. It's not, when I read this poem previously, I sort of thought, well, actually, it's talking about a fly. A fly lays lays worms basically, or lays maggots, and so but actually that's not the phrasing. The phrasing is sort of the worm that flies. It's actually a very short poem. I'm going to read it now, just
Sure.
to sort of for the sake of the listeners. So it's called The Sick Rose. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. So the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. Such simple words, such sort of easily understandable, not metaphysical at all, and yet so haunting and perverse in a way.
And obviously it's kind of been no doubt like done to death, but I think it still has the power to, well, at the very least it's memorable and it enters into language. O rose, thou art sick. That's very, for me anyway, that comes to mind.
Yes.
And it also still contains the ambiguity of like whether this worm is external, is it just death, decay, so on, or is it something integral to the nature of a rose? Is the storm the external storm, like
Yes.
the fact that beautiful things are exposed to the outside world, or is
it
the storm in the symbol of the rose and is in love, and does it have a integral mixed nature which problematizes it?
Which is almost an intensification of the maybe more overused notion of just the rose and the thorn, right? The thorn and the rose are to go together.
Which Blake openly uses as well. He doesn't shy away from bold and common metaphors.
Yes. So that is some context then for kind of why you love Blake as a poet and what you love aesthetically.
And I find him in art and culture, he's one of the great figures. I like how Promethean, how energetic he was as a person, and I also think his what we know of his kind of temperament and his life is just appealing.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about this book that we're going to focus on today, which is Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And I understand that that's partly sort of there's this guy Swedenborg, right? And I think he wrote, I haven't read Swedenborg myself. Have you read him by any chance?
Oh, bits and pieces.
Yeah. I guess he's maybe not as interesting and as...
well, at the time, he was a very important figure if you were that way inclined. And just a knowing figure.
If you were kind of in that sort of free-thinking, nonconformist type.
Right.
Yeah. So Swedenborg had a book called, I think it was just called Heaven and Hell. And I understand that this is a bit of a take on that. So the marriage of heaven and hell. And even in the title, we see this notion of contraries, which we were just kind of talking about. The coming together of opposites, the mutual necessity of opposites. Heaven and hell have a marriage. It's not just that one is completely separated from the other. So there's this book, and the way that Blake produces his works is essentially he engraves them, so that they're not just like printed words, but they're kind of written, handwritten essentially words, intermixed with images. And so on the screen as we go through this book, I'm planning to put the images that we're talking about.
Well, should we also say that, he was an entrepreneur and an innovator when it came to printing and engraving.
Yes.
And it was unusual for someone to do every part of the process.
Yes.
Blake was an egalitarian and quite radical.
Yes.
Well, very radical at this point, I would say, in his politics, given his social context.
Yes.
It was very unusual for someone like that to be in the shop,
yes,
doing the engraving and the printmaking and everything. And he developed a unique method. Basically, interestingly, it's an inversion of the normal way, just like there are many inversions.
The use of corrosives, right? The use of acids to eat into the metal.
Yeah, well, basically, in Blake's works, the raised part is what makes the print.
Exactly.
Whereas normally it would be the other way around.
And I understand he essentially wrote onto the metal plates with a particular kind of something that was anti-corrosive, basically, and then applied the corrosives.
Well,
we'll get to a part in Marriage of Heaven how he talks about this is the printing method of
again,
hell.
he doesn't shy away from
from
using that metaphor, but I think we don't entirely, because this is another inversion, we don't entirely know
exactly how he did it.
But it's also quite possible that he wrote everything backwards so that it could transfer properly.
Of course, yes.
But we don't entirely know that he did it.
Yeah. So there's multiple
it'd be
satanic...
quite poetic if he did.
Yeah, there's multiple satanic resonances here.
Yes.
So let's jump into the book. So I don't know, where do we want to start? I think that what I'm going to do is maybe just take it generally from start to finish, but there's a number of places that I've kind of highlighted as being of interest. And so if we're in a particular area where something that you've read jumps out at you, that you find interesting, just bring it up.
Sure thing. I'll let you jog my memory, and I'll jump in.
Yeah. But I guess if we're looking at, I'll skip the very first page.
Okay.
We'll go to the second one. Unless of course you wanted to mention something about that, the very first page where he lays out the argument, so to speak, the sort of preface to the work.
It's up to you, really. I mean, we could circle back to it as well. I
mean,
guess it sets the tone.
Yes.
It's making various references to biblical passages, but kind of inverting them or their meaning.
Yes.
And it also introduces Rintrah, which is one of his characters from his kind of Blakean mythopoeia.
And maybe that's something we should mention about Blake too, is essentially he creates his own mythology. And so not so much in this work, where you only get maybe a couple of names from his mythology, but certainly in his other works, he's using this mythology that he's created for himself, essentially. So I believe in this case, Rintrah is essentially maybe a personification of like revolutionary wrath or something like that. Is that consistent with what you understand?
Yes, and it could also be, in this case, referring to Blake himself in a sense.
Yes, as being that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think people also
revolutionary wrath, to clarify, in a good sense, because Blake at this stage, this is just after, would be just after the French Revolution, right? So
during
essentially, during. He's very much for the French Revolution.
Yes.
And
all revolutions.
Yeah.
And I think people associate Rintrah with Elijah sometimes as well. But a kind of radical, revolutionary, wrathful, in a way, figure.
And I'll read the opening line. So Rintrah roars and shakes his fires in the burdened air. Hungry clouds swag on the deep. And so this is how the whole book opens. So it opens with this sort of fiery, ferocious kind of tone, I guess you could say. And then in the next page, there's a few interesting passages. And so, contraries. Without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. That's something that really stood out to me when I first read this. Something I should also mention just in passing, So we've talked a lot about Nietzsche. I mean, I think our previous talk, a lot of that was around Nietzsche. This is one of the many examples in this book, which was written significantly before Nietzsche, where it feels very Nietzschean to me. This idea of sort of contraries both being necessary, everything being necessary to life. But what do you kind of take from that passage about contraries?
Well, I guess obviously for Blake, it's directed at. I mean, the whole thing is satirizes and attacks conventional interpretations of religion, of the Bible, of the Christian tradition. Obviously, for Nietzsche, good and evil aren't going to have the same reality that they maybe do for Blake. Although Blake is so satirical and ironical in this that he completely upends their conventional meanings.
Well, one thing that Nietzsche does do is he emphasizes the necessity of what we call evil. So he does do that kind of flipping thing, when he sort of, emphasizes the things that we consider evil as actually being necessary for society, necessary for existence, necessary even for virtue. So I feel like Blake's doing a little bit of the same thing throughout The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in the sense of emphasizing energy, emphasizing...
I think the key line in this segment is where Blake says, good is the passive that obeys reason, evil is the active springing from energy. Energy is everything for Blake.
And this was really cool when I was reading it, not having read it before, not really knowing what Blake's philosophy was. Yeah, it's a philosophy of energy. This is essential. This is the key. The core.
And I think that's actually the part that's. I don't want to overcommit to any kind of comparison there, but that's the part that that's the aspect of Blake that sounds Nietzschean to me. Energy is akin to the will to power, the uncontainable force of life or will
of life itself
that animates everything. That's what I would say about that.
Evil is the active springing from energy. Good is the passive that obeys reason. So it's interesting thinking about energy. So you've talked about, you mentioned the will to power. That's an obvious analogy. I guess the emphasis more with the word energy perhaps is a kind of a driving force. Like a will to power. I think actually in effect has a very similar meaning, but the feeling is more of like a reaching out to grasp or acquire something, whereas energy is sort of like a force that pushes forward. And I really enjoyed the experience of reading Blake, because I think everyone can connect with, to some degree, that experience of having abundant energy and what that actually looks like in terms of what that actually does for your creativity, what that does for your interactions with others, what that does for your intuition, all those kind of things. And I was sort of reflecting on this, and then I was thinking of Nietzsche, and I actually have a quote from Nietzsche where he kind of talks about this. I think he talks about this, and I'd like to hear what you think about this whole thing, because there's a quote from Nietzsche. This is from Twilight of the Idols that's frequently quoted. I think particularly Peterson likes to quote it, and I think that existential types like to quote it. Yeah, it's so this is how it's typically translated, and it's from Twilight of the Idols. It's in Maxims and Missiles 12. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. So that that seems to be about meaning. It's about meaning. It's about the meaning that we make for ourselves. That's what drives us. But I was recently reading The Gay Science, so still a relatively late work, although admittedly Twilight is later. But this is what Nietzsche says. He says, two kinds of causes that are often confounded. And this, by the way, is aphorism 360 from The Gay Science. The first kind of cause is a quantum of dammed up energy that is waiting to be used up somehow for something, while the second kind is, compared to this energy, something quite insignificant, for the most part a little accident in accordance with which this quantum discharges itself in one particular way, a match versus a ton of powder. Among these little accidents and matches I include so-called purposes, as well as the even much more so-called vocations. They are relatively random, arbitrary, almost indifferent in relation to the tremendous quantum of energy that presses, as I have said, to be used up somehow. The usual view is different. People are accustomed to consider the goal, purposes, vocations, etc., as the driving force, in keeping with a very ancient era. But it is merely the directing force. One has mistaken the helmsman for the steam. And so to me, that actually goes against that idea that it might be expressed in Twilight, which is that the why matters more than the how. In this case, actually, it's the energy that matters.
Yes.
And the purpose comes later. What do you think about that?
Well, like Blake, Nietzsche wasn't afraid to be ambiguous or
contradict
even,
himself.
Well, if he is contradicting himself, yes, he wasn't afraid of it. I think it depends how you interpret that, because I'm being a little bit quiet because I don't want to get ahead of the argument, because I think Blake actually outlines what he means by these terms a lot more in the next passages. But to be clear, when you say a why, or when Nietzsche says a why, to translate that into the Blakean idea of energy or even evil, that's including every kind of chthonic force that arises in human beings, every want, every excess. And he says later on that it might be in the Proverbs of Hell. If you can contain a desire or an energy, it's because it's weak enough to be contained.
So we're talking about Blake here, not necessarily
Blake,
Nietzsche.
Blake,
we're talking about Blake.
Blake.
Yeah. So but basically what you're saying is, for Blake, that energy it includes all possible forces. It's not just necessarily.
Well, I think that's why he uses the term evil, because he's quite explicitly talking about the things which we think of as being aberrant. It's a desire, and it's but we don't normally think of our aberrant desires or impulses or actions as being our why for why we get up in the morning to be a bad person, quote unquote.
Well, I guess I guess when I'm talking about what Nietzsche says about the why to live, I'm actually saying that maybe it's not about the why to live. Maybe it's just about the fact that you have energy or you don't have energy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So let me flesh that out a bit more. I mean, from my own experience, it is actually a bit ambiguous. Like, sometimes it seems that purpose really matters to how I feel, to how I act, to how I think, right? Actually having a meaning, having a purpose actually really, really matters a lot. Other times it actually doesn't, purpose or meaning really doesn't have much of an effect. And if I'm really drained in energy, it's at least for the time being, pretty hopeless. And it's the energy that...
You're taking it in a negative sense. That without the energy, the why loses its...
Well, I'm raising the question, right? Because I think there'd be some kind of position or group of people that would say, actually, the energy that you have almost physiologically doesn't actually matter. What matters is the meaning. And that's what drives you through life.
Well, I'm too...
And then there's another position that would say, actually, no, the meaning is relatively arbitrary. That seems to be what Nietzsche's arguing in that passage in Gay Science. The meaning's relatively arbitrary. It's the physiological energy that's primary. And what you do with it doesn't matter.
Well, I come down on that side.
Yeah, without hesitation.
For me, that's not really a question.
It's just obvious to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the argument in this book.
It seems that way. It seems Blake
he's certainly not
comes
talking
down
about
on that
meaning.
side. Yeah,
when he refers to energy or
yes. And we might say, we can talk about meaning in terms of this. Maybe we can talk about purposes in terms of where that energy is directed. What the desires are and what the objects of the desires are, but really what's primary is the energy. Really what's primary is that force. I just think it's an interesting question. I mean, like you said, you come down pretty strongly on the one side. That seems true to you. I'm not so sure. I think that at different times, maybe different things, you can see things in a different way. But I think that for those who might want to overemphasize the importance of meaning, I think energy is also very important. Like, I think that just having energy makes a big difference, and especially I've noticed it in regard to creativity, right? Like, creativity, perhaps you could say meaning can drive creativity. You can be inspired by an idea or an ideal that you want to achieve, but sometimes you may not have any particular idea or ideal, but you just have a superabundance of energy. And it seems to me that this just wants to flow out of you and expand. And so long as you just sit down and do something or whatever, it just naturally expresses itself. That seems to me what maybe Blake experienced his whole life.
Absolutely. But yeah, I would just say in this context, Blake is absolutely including that, but he's putting it in the same category as all sorts of things which conventional morality would condemn.
Right. So because we're talking
he's
about
saying it comes out
things.
of the same source, the same spring.
And that's important, I guess, to clarify, especially because he does call it evil.
Well, yeah, I would be wary of sanitizing and making it sound like we just need to be more in touch with our primordial energies because we could use them for good.
Because we're talking about here about creativity and stuff like that, and that's all very well and inspiring. But yeah, we're also talking about sexuality and all its manifestation.
Not that. I mean, I think that's fairly tame, though.
We're talking about violence. We're talking about domination. We're talking about
absolutely.
cruelty.
Yeah, the same themes that Nietzsche openly lauds later on.
Exactly.
If you want to make that connection, I think that's the connection.
And that's the key. Okay. Do you think we've maybe, for now at least, talked enough about energy, or?
Well, I just think it gets developed more as it goes on.
I agree. I think the next page will actually give us a good opportunity to talk about it, because this is, I believe, the errors. Yes, that's right. So the beginning of this page is, the top of this page, the voice of the devil. So this is the words of the devil, and he identifies 3 errors. This is the devil that identifies these errors. Basically, these errors are promulgated by religion, by sacred texts. And the first error is that man has 2 real existing principles, a body and a soul. So there's a kind of dualism there. The second one is that energy called evil is alone from the body, and that reason called good is alone from the soul. So again, this kind of dualism. And then the third error is that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. And so already in that phrase, you can kind of see where he's going here, for following his energies. And then the 3 contraries, I might read this out in his words. The 3 contraries to that. Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul discerned by the 5 senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. Number 2, energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. This also struck me as a very Nietzschean passage. And 3, energy is eternal delight.
Yes, that's a great line. I love that. Well, I mean, it's an expression of his vitalism.
Yes.
He refuses to reduce anything to that dualism, or, I think he views that as a kind of almost neo-Gnostic position, even though it's also orthodox.
The position that there's a body and a
soul. The strict separation of body and soul.
Body and soul, yeah. What's interesting is he does make soul primary, but in a sense, but he says, body is the expression of soul, so to speak, or the part of soul perceived by the 5 senses. So in a way, I think I did say that part is Nietzschean, but in a way it's an inversion of Nietzsche, because he would say the body is primary and the soul is a kind of expression of that.
It's complicated because they both posit something beyond individuals as an animating force.
Yes.
So, I mean, in Blake's language,
which
he'll always come down on that side, but I don't know. I don't actually know how important that is.
I don't think so either, because I think that practically it has the same effect, in the sense that...
Well, for the
because here Blake says that energy comes from the body.
Yeah.
And energy is the critical thing here. So I think either way, like pragmatically speaking, you experience energy bodily.
But there's an intentional ambiguity as well. He's making what look like materialist kind of arguments, but also vitalist. So it's...
Yes. Blake is making
materialist arguments. Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Well, in collapsing that dualism.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well,
from the perspective,
even though he collapses it into soul, like soul being the primary thing.
Yeah, because I think if you follow through the entire thing,
yes,
he's continually using biological terms.
Yes.
There's going to be parts later where he retells things in a way that seem to have a radically different view of what divinity is, or how it's separate from human beings.
Separate or not separate from human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Energy is eternal delight.
Yeah.
What do we make of that?
Well, I think it's a very a very nice expression of his vitalism.
Yes.
I think it's his way of saying that what we do is an emanation of... It's like the play of eternity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, to relate it back to Nietzsche, it's something like, life is inherently
not that it's... blissful. I mean, it can be taken two ways, I suppose.
Yeah.
In the one sense, it's that we can have access to eternity in ourselves and our own sensual experience through this feeling of energy.
Yes.
But it also implies perhaps eternity somehow has a perspective on this, or eternity somehow perceives through this emanation.
Yes.
Or delights through this emanation.
I haven't thought enough about this, but it actually seems
it runs
even
both
deeper
ways.
than
It cuts
I
both
thought.
ways.
Yeah. Because it invokes eternity. It evokes eternity.
I think every one we come to like that is going to cut both ways.
Yeah.
That's how I take it anyway.
Yeah. There might be a better page to talk about this, but I love that. I mean, throughout the marriage of heaven and hell, at least implicitly, like fire and flames are kind of the imagery of energy and the imagery of delight and the imagery of genius. And so I love actually what he does with that. In a way, I guess it's kind of obvious, but I love how he takes that up and sort of says, okay, I'm going to keep the imagery of hell. I'm not going to sort of just flip it around and say actually heaven is populated by the people I like, the free thinkers and the free lovers potentially.
He uses the imagery, but describes himself as enjoying it and finding it stimulating.
Yeah. Like I was walking around hell and I was enjoying it and I was loving like all the genius there.
But of course that's true to life, because while we might be afraid of negative things happening to us or our loved ones or just the facts of life, decay, death.
Yes.
We also obviously derive pleasure from things that cause harm.
Yes.
To ourselves and others, and there's no getting away from that.
Yes.
There's no way to reconstruct our life on earth that avoids that.
Yes. Exactly. So hell is the world, but not in a condemnatory sense.
But it's okay.
It's okay. It's not even okay.
It's more than okay.
It's more than okay. Exactly.
Well, and just to clarify on the materialism statement again, I'm just pointing out that what he's saying, I think, cuts both ways. He's kind of making what sounds like what we might call a very modern sounding biological account of how the living world works, a material account. But like you say, at the same time, he's in this kind of mystical religious mode, particularly in his language.
Yes.
I just think you can't reduce these things.
When you say
he's not arguing one side or the other, in my opinion.
When you say he's making a material account of how the world works, is that because he's evoking the concept of energy? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think the way it reads to me, energy as he uses it isn't something inscrutable and kind of in that context, it's not mystical in the sense that we can't grasp it in plain language.
Yes.
He's talking about desire. He's talking about genius.
Yes.
Literal feeling of energy.
Yeah.
The sensual feeling of energy.
Yes. Yeah.
And also just life, whatever the animating
Yeah.
life force might be.
And perhaps just the energy of physics to an extent of just like
exactly,
the stuff
well,
that
forces.
Yeah,
the
forces,
problem is you're
yeah.
you're not going to settle on a
No.
language that sounds unambiguously one way or the other.
Exactly, and essentially he's a poet. He's not a philosopher
Yeah.
or a logician, and this word, this poetic word, is extremely evocative. And in a way, I think, I mean, I keep referring to Nietzsche, but that's just because who I've been thinking about a lot lately. In a way, I think almost energy is a better word that Nietzsche could have used, and I wonder why maybe he didn't pick that up, as opposed to will to power, because will to power is a bit more in your face, and he wanted to be a bit more confrontational.
Yeah.
But I feel
Blake uses the word evil.
Well, he
you
does.
can't really
You're
get
right.
much
Identifies
more
it with evil.
confrontational than
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I mean, another. I don't want personally. I don't want to commit to like going back and forth with these comparisons with Nietzsche and Blake, but just riffing on what you said there, there is a similarity in that Blake is arguing against a certain worldview, also espoused by philosophers, particularly English philosophers or British philosophers around his time.
Yeah.
But he's arguing against it not using the conventions of philosophy.
Yes. Yes.
Nietzsche, there's definitely a similarity there.
Yes.
Nietzsche was making considered arguments against particular philosophies and worldviews, but not using the conventions of not in the style of German idealism or anything like that. Using poetry and his philological background.
Absolutely.
And neither of them had any kind of undue deference to those forms.
And just on that point, and maybe we won't dwell too much on sort of the Nietzsche-Blake resonance, but maybe just for listeners, there's no evidence that Nietzsche actually read Blake. Is that accurate?
Oh no, yeah. I think there's no Blake in his library. Apparently, he was translated at that time, and it actually might be another interesting little kind of historical biographical thing. Blake really didn't become as popular as he became until quite a lot later, quite a lot after his death. At his time, he wasn't he had disciples or people who were around him, people who really admired him in his time, and also he was connected to a lot of famous personages, Johnson, Wollstonecraft. At times they were operating out of the same publishing house, but he wasn't like a big public intellectual figure. Again, much like Nietzsche, he wasn't that well known until
his
later.
life. And we think maybe, or you told me that the link, if there is a link, might be through Emerson. Emerson liked Blake. And Nietzsche liked
Emerson does talk about him, as I recall, and Nietzsche has some very positive things to say about Emerson. But yeah, again, from my perspective, it's not that there's, I'm not really. I don't think it's necessary to get genealogical about it or anything like that. I don't think it works like that. I just think that there's a shared vitalism and the fact that they were both, gadflies on their respective thought structures, and they came to create problems. Put it that way. They weren't there to appease people or like spread a nice doctrine around that we could.
That word, and you've used it quite a few times now, vitalism. That's crucial for who Blake is, maybe who Nietzsche is. What does vitalism mean to you?
Well, in this context, again, I don't want to jump ahead because I think he might go into his differenes like with Swedenborg and everyone later on.
We can refer ahead. It's all good to evoke something.
Sure. Yeah. So in this case, and he also had differences with what was the state of science and kind of official philosophy in his time. Our empiricism was becoming more and more proficient. People were proposing mechanistic interpretations of the universe. the laws of physics, Newton, and
Yes.
also proto-psychology and
Yes.
and biology, the living world. And Blake wouldn't necessarily just reject those out of hand. He just felt that they were incomplete. They don't
Yes.
in any way capture what animates life, what makes life life.
So vitalism is anti-mechanistic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And because there's some such thing, I don't know. This
Well,
may
because
be debatable, but
because a
there's-
mechanistic system can't necessarily capture.
the reality.
Yeah, or you
of-
could. It can't. Certainly can't capture the reality, but it may not. Well, you could say it'll never be a sufficient description,
Yes.
and description itself isn't sufficient.
Yes.
Yeah.
And description itself isn't
Yeah,
sufficient.
yeah,
Yeah. So there's something in vitalism as a position that eludes even philosophy because it's actually
Yes, because there's also something that escapes description.
because it escapes description. It refers you back to real life.
Yeah,
It refers you back to yourself,
Yeah.
which again I think is what Nietzsche does. I think
course,
he has that effect.
Of course,
on,
he makes the same
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is the three eras and the three true contraries.
Did we
to
cover
those
all
eras.
of them?
Potentially, was there any?
Oh, you're not going to burn in hell, folks. So
You're not going to burn in hell. That's an era, especially just for following your energies.
Yes.
I mean, do we want to maybe say if there's any danger? Is there any danger in Blake? Like, just follow your energies. Is that good advice to give to someone? Or
I don't think it's advice. I don't think he's advising that. But I think he also means what he's saying there, or through the devil. I think following. You're not going to burn for following your energies means that there's no judgment in the sense that religions say there is. The worst type of person you can think of, I won't go into gory examples, but the worst kind of person following their energies is not going to be punished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not eternally after death.
No.
There may be natural consequences for their actions.
There may be, but there may not be.
But there may not be, because that is
to say
contingent.
say there must be in this life to try and
Make it a
shift the
metaphysical-
buck.
Yeah.
Yeah, Blake is against all of that, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
So you could argue at least that that's a more honest view of the world, because it's just like, some people do what we consider be pretty horrific things, and they might just never receive any any punishment, if you will, for it. The universe
Right.
is not moral.
Yeah, I mean, to me it seems pretty obvious.
Yeah. And what's more, maybe not all of them, but maybe at least some of them, there's an ambivalence in what they do. For instance, there's something good generated out of that, or there's something productive about that, or at least to some extent.
There's a necessity. That's also in there.
Yeah, and there's a necessity.
This is where it's radical.
Do you think that's even in Blake? I think it's in Nietzsche, but do you think it's in Blake? Yeah.
Personally, I think it's in Blake.
They must do what they do.
Yeah, I think Blake puts people in the uncomfortable position of if you want good to be gratis, if you want all that's good, all that you cherish to be like an integral part of the world and a free kind of emanation, then you have to take everything else.
Yeah, that's the fundamental.
But also, he's quite clear that the everything else is really the driving force of history, of life, of expansion, of moving upwards.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we can be more explicit. He's writing in the time of the French Revolution. He supports it.
Yes.
He supports revolutionary activity in general. He despises.
So he supports revolutionary violence, basically. I mean.
Yeah, and he despises the British Ancien regime.
Yeah.
He despises the aristocracy.
Yeah.
Blake follows his own energies, his own heart when it comes to the position of the toiling classes and the underclass in England. He's naturally, openly sympathetic to them.
Yes.
He doesn't stop to.
Yes.
So in this case, he's arguing against Swedenborg, which I think we get to in a moment about exactly why. but he's also arguing against, say, Edmund Burke,
Yeah.
who's saying, hey, well, look, you know, let's not rock the boat too much because
Yeah.
we got away lucky here. Look what's happening in France.
Yeah.
Blake looks at France and says, this isn't a reason to
Yeah.
pull the brake.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, like, we need this to happen here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's not just that he had a kind of mystical acceptance of violence and what we call the negative aspects of life. He was comfortable with advocating it. Maybe that changed later in his life, but
Well, I was going to
addressing
say,
this work.
just from sort of reading his Wikipedia page, it seems like maybe his views on revolution changed towards the end of his life. But for now, at least, he's like, yes, the French Revolution. Like,
And honestly, I don't think that's super relevant to reading this work. I don't think he had a revelation and became a conservative.
right? Yeah,
It's just not that.
Yeah. But this was perhaps before like the worst of the terror and so on. So I'm not sure about the exact timeline. But
I mean, there had been massacres.
Yeah.
I think it's around the time of what they call the September massacres, where they
okay.
no, maybe I'm a bit early.
So
Prussia was invading, and they massacred the people they were holding in the Bastille,
Right.
just as a kind of expedient measure, and as an expression.
So in any case, there's enough. There's
He didn't-
enough
he didn't
examples
balk,
of
put it that
violence
way.
to
Yeah. Well, and people in Britain at the time were absolutely outraged by the American Revolution.
Yes.
They were still
Yes.
traumatized by
Yes.
it. Whereas for us,
Yes.
it doesn't even
It's like-
we don't necessarily associate it with radicalism.
No, I know it's like the most conservative.
Well,
thing
it's
possible.
not, but it
I
is.
know,
It's not, but it
that-
is, yeah.
That's how you kind of
Anyway,
think about it.
that's what I would say on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on. So, what have we got next? What's the next page? So we're kind of getting a bit closer to the Proverbs of Hell.
Do we have a memorable fancy?
We do have a memorable fancy. As I was walking among the fires of hell, delighted with the enjoyments of genius, which to angels look like torment and insanity, I collected some of their proverbs. So this is the introduction to the Proverbs of Hell. But this is what I was referring to before, right? The fires of hell that look to angels like torment and insanity. So he's kind of owning the fires of hell. He's owning the ambivalence there, but he's also owning the metaphor of energy. Like fire is energy, and I guess by extension, like the airy, cloudy heavens are what? Like absence, emptiness,
Vacuum.
vacuous.
I think is a term that he likes.
Yeah. But let's see what happens before that. I guess right before that, he talks a little bit about Milton. Actually, there's that famous line.
Well, there's also an aspect in which the whole work is mirroring Milton to some extent.
Yes.
It's set up as a maybe part homage, part parody. I don't know how to...
Yes. Well, we get the figure of Satan, and the figure of Satan being put forth as
I think the passage on Milton is quite
Messiah. Yeah,
demonstrative of what he's...
Well, let's read the famous passage on Milton. The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. And it's kind of picking up on something that a lot of readers notice about, just reading Paradise Lost. The really great stuff is...
Satan is cool.
Is about, Satan's speeches, is about hell, is about the demons, and not so much about God and the angels. And actually he says something, about essentially Satan being... the actual Messiah, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, here's a part that refers to Job as well. So he says in Paradise Lost, the governor or reason is called Messiah. So in Paradise Lost, obviously Christ is Messiah. Jesus is Messiah.
Yeah.
But that's a inversion for Blake of the actual reality, which is that Satan actually is Messiah. In the book of Job, this is a quote from Marriage of Heaven and Hell. In the book of Job, Milton's Messiah is called Satan. So what Christ is in Paradise Lost is Satan in the book of Job.
Yeah, just to be clear, in Blake's terms, the governor or reason is always a negative thing.
Yes, to be clear, just in case that wasn't clear.
Yeah, it gets a bit. He's intentionally mixing up categories. But
Satan is the sort of real hero of Paradise Lost, even though, let's say, maybe Milton was on a conscious level opposed to that or resisting that. That is nevertheless
it came out through him.
It came through because he was using his energies, because he was a poet, because he was creative, and it's impossible not to come out if you're of the devil's party. And so, that's really interesting. And so I guess maybe we can move on to the Proverbs of Hell.
Yeah.
Actually, just before they get into the Proverbs, there's a beautiful line, or a beautiful couple of lines. How do you know, but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight, closed by your senses 5.
Yes.
I just love that. I just love that as an image.
Yeah, it's a great line. And that's another theme that runs through the whole work as well. The kind of, I think he uses the term doors of perception somewhere.
He does, in this book,
the idea that there's kind of an infinity in all these things, but we're just not capable of, I think he says somewhere that we're just peeking through the, seeing the pinpoints of light.
It's an absolutely magical kind of worldview and way of looking at the world.
And again, to maybe precede something we might get to, if I recall, his eschatology also seems to be basically just ripping that open.
Yes.
So he kind of identifies apocalypse with some kind of enlightenment, or total
seeing the
total
infinity.
communion with
seeing the infinity in everything. Yeah. It maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. I was going to get into that, but we'll put a pin in that. So, the Proverbs of Hell. I've written down a few that I love. Do you have a few that really stood out to you?
Well, let me just jog my memory, because otherwise I don't want to go to ones that are very kind of overly well known, I guess, overly discussed. But where are we? Ah, yes.
So just for listeners, this is essentially a collection of, Proverbs, very short, 1 or 2 lines, and allegedly the Proverbs of Hell, as opposed to sort of the book of Proverbs that you get in the Bible, which is written in a very similar style. Yes. And go ahead.
Well, yeah, okay. So I'm just looking at them, and I can riff on a few that are on this plate. But to get back to our little discussion about his political radicalism and his opposition to the conservatives of his day, which were really the first conservatives in the way that we use that term now. That's the origin of that idea as a kind of discrete political philosophy.
Yes.
Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead. That's kind of his position on that. Let's not
throw away the old. Just run right over it. Is that essentially what you take from that?
Yeah, and don't be crippled by this kind of sentimentality, by this appeal to your ancestors.
The sort of reverence for what is
they don't
old.
have in this telling, they don't have as much to teach you as your instincts.
Yes.
A lot of references to his kind of elevation of instinct and the wisdom of emotion, of desire and feelings. I quite like this line. All wholesome food is caught without a net or a trap. To me, that says sometimes when you go out and you plan and you look for something and you try and apply your reason to it,
Yeah.
you come up with a worse result
Yes.
than what just comes to you.
It comes to you naturally. It
Yeah.
comes to you through using courage, strength, and your natural abilities.
Yes.
Um,
And I think. What do you have?
I have a few.
Yeah. Let's go through yours, and then
I'll throw some
if
at
there's
you.
any that
Yeah.
that I still want to cover.
So starting on plate 7, the first plate that
Yes.
goes into the Proverbs, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom.
Yeah,
So this
that's
is
a very classic line. That
But you know, if we want to dig into that, I mean, it's counterintuitive. Why does the road of excess lead to wisdom? Like, what do you think the connection is there?
Well, I think it's another, in a sense, it's another way of making that argument for instinct, for desire. It's also, of course, just an inversion of what would have been good Christian morality.
Well, exactly, and that much is clear. But then, and so it's got a shock value. But then, if you think, why wisdom? Does the road of excess lead to wisdom?
Well,
and how?
I think there's another where he just says, something like, "You don't know what enough is until you know what too much is." So, in a sense, in that simple sense, following your desire is educational as well.
Because you learn your natural limits.
Yes, it's educational in a natural, almost kind of physical way.
Whereas consider the alternative, which is that, okay, sure, the limit, let's say the limit is the same, but you actually never get any experience of it. You're just sort of imposing this scheme, this reason, this kind of rule or law on yourself. And so you never get to experience it. So it's purely something abstract.
And, it sounds, it's a very Sufi sounding line. But, of course, for Blake, the life force or the Godhead or this energy, which is everything, essentially.
Yes.
It's not a doctrine or a rule or an idea or even a sentiment. It is, in fact, an excess.
Yes.
So excess is identified directly with, Blake's God. Put it that way.
Is an excess. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, it's
I was going to say experience, but that's not quite what you're getting at. What does it mean to say it is an excess?
It's the excess of energy.
Okay.
It has to go beyond.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you don't go beyond, if you don't transgress, you don't get to wisdom.
You don't get to wisdom because that is the foundation of reality.
Yes.
Really, it's that going beyond and going. And again,
like you can't be taught wisdom. You can't. You can't.
Life is perpetually its own self-overcoming.
Yes.
Nietzsche. I mean, like that. It's the same idea. I just can't stop. Sorry, you'll have to forgive me. I can't stop finding parallels.
Yeah.
Okay, so I get that. Okay, I like this one as well. I think it's a little bit more clear. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. And so that sort of just goes to the idea that actually it's again very Nietzschean in the sense that it's kind of looking at the motives for
it's actually
some moral phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's a good point to just bring up a thing that's so striking to me about Blake, given his positioning in time and history. He precedes so many psychological approaches and insights. He's so psychological. The whole work is psychological. And he seems very insistent on that. Even though he has totally his own language, which you could miss it potentially if you just read bits and pieces. But it's all psychological, and he fully understands, the layers of complexity that underlie any human action, or even what people say about what they're doing, or what they say their motivations are. And that's a good example. But it's a good pithy.
It is, and it is genuinely wise. Like it is a little portion of wisdom. Another interesting one, and very, I think, Blakean. he who desires but acts not breeds pestilence.
Yeah.
Actually, I want to tie that to
Well,
one that comes later, which is even
harsher
more
one,
extreme.
Yeah, there's one that comes to mind that you might want to mention.
There's maybe a little bit of irony here, just beware. But sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desire.
Yeah.
So always act on your desires, because I guess this is the other part to it, right? Because you will breed pestilence. In other words, not acting on your desires, this is what I take from it, not acting on your desires doesn't eliminate your desires. It doesn't make you an angel. It doesn't make you perfect. It doesn't make you pure. It just means that those desires fester. They have no outlet,
Yes.
and then they produce other phenomena, and that, again, then we can go in a Nietzschean direction. They become maybe resentful. They become self,
and I think
self-tormenting.
the idea is also that, energy can give birth to genius,
Yes.
creativity,
Yes.
change.
Yes.
It can move life and the world and history forward.
Yes.
If your primary motivation is to contain these desires, to repress them,
Yes.
you become ruled by the repressive function,
Yes.
which is just a shallow shadow of what life should be,
Yes, and
what life is.
Reading into it a bit, you could say that repressive function is also just one manifestation of energy. It's just energy turned against itself, or something like that, or energy turned against itself in a particular situation. So you don't escape that. You don't ever transcend energy and arrive at reason. You always are dealing with energy, and I think that goes back to what Blake said earlier in the book in terms of reason being the outer circumference or limit or something like that of energy. And so there is a relationship between the two, but energy is actually primary. Energy is the thing.
And on the societal level, that repression, that blockage of divine energy is religion.
Is religion.
Is religion.
Yes,
Yeah.
is religion.
Yeah. This doesn't pull any punches on that.
Religion, at least in any kind of organized form, is bad for Blake. Yeah. Okay, this is a great one. Eternity is in love with the productions of time.
Yeah, I was
Amazing.
considering mentioning that one as well, but I figured you'd have it written down.
Yeah, written down and underlined too, because that is, I think, a really important one. And I think maybe Iain McGilchrist mentions it in his recent book. He's probably mentioned it somewhere, because I think it's very much sort of in his way of thinking. Like it's actual embodied existence in time. It's actual, like we think of Bergson, we think of duration, we think of that, like that is what's generative of new things. That's what's creative. That's what human life is about, not the abstract, I guess in this sense, like I think it's possible Blake uses infinity, eternity in different ways in his works, but I think this sense of eternity definitely has the feeling of the more abstract, logical eternity, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
Like a completely unproductive eternity, because how can it be productive if it can't change? How can it be productive if it has no duration? So there's a glorification of time.
Yes, yeah. Well, because it's the only way that eternity can be expressed.
Right, and that's I love that way of putting it. It's the only way that eternity can be expressed. And so time isn't a negation of eternity, but something like
well, it's another contrary.
Yeah,
To have eternity, you have to have temporality, and vice versa.
Yes.
And I know you love McGilchrist. I don't know that much about him, but there is a part later on which seems very much in.
Is it a proverb, or is it later in the book?
It's later in the book, but when we get to it, I'll
definitely point it out. An interesting one, and I think we may have answered this. I've got a big question mark next to this one. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. And I was wondering, what does that actually mean? And I think we might have touched on it when we were talking about the road of excess leading to wisdom, right? If you actually experience your foolishness, or what your foolishness leads to, then you can become genuinely wise. Would that be how you take that, or is it something a bit different than that?
I think there are. I guess there are other possible interpretations.
Yeah.
I'd have to kind of think about it a little bit.
Yeah.
But I did find that one interesting as well. Because like you say, on the one hand, it could be that foolishness or kind of this naive intuition is like a path to wisdom, but is it also that he's actually saying that it in itself is an expression of a kind of valid expression of energy.
Yes. Yeah.
Like it's our reticence to fully commit that somehow limits us.
Exactly, and maybe
because he's always on the verge of. There's always that. I mean, I'll say I find that while it's fiery and emotional and bold, there's also a certain logic and sobriety and sanity, I would say, that runs through it. Yes, he's just saying things that are provocative, but but there are bits where you wonder if he is advocating for a little bit of insanity, and on that not just intuition or instinct, but actual.
On that note, I want to maybe put some of these things in a particular context, because these are the Proverbs of Hell, and hell is the contrary of heaven. And so we can't necessarily read them as all being exactly the position of Blake. No. There's a level of remove here, a bit like in Plato's dialogues, where if you get, everything's voiced by Socrates, it's not necessarily Plato's view. And so I was thinking about that before when I was thinking about the eras, like the voice of the devil, and you've got the eras, and then these are the true contraries to these eras. But the whole setup is the contrary of heaven's voice.
Well, what I would say is it's not a matter of I don't think with any of this it's a matter of where he's stating his true position and where he's not. It's that anything that's stated can be true and also contradicted.
And have
he has no problem with. I mean, in fact, that's his method. So,
but you could say that's baked into the structure of the work in a sense, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's something to be aware of, because then we're not interpreting it as, is this absolutely true? We're interpreting it as, in what way is this extreme or this contrary or this position? In what way is this true? And then the opposite will be true, or in some way at least will be true. Even if it's heavenly, even if it's reason, it will still have some limited truth to it. Going on to the next page, I mean, this maybe is just something to read rather than and reflect too much on, but I really liked it. The roaring of lions, the howling of wolves, the raging of the stormy sea, and the destructive sword are portions of eternity too great for the eye of man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's brilliant. That's brilliant to me. And again, it reminds me of Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night. It's that same idea, I think, of the immensity of creation or of the world.
But it's also saying that it's also a kind of perspectivism, because it's pointing out that these are all parts of creation. These all partake in divinity, or however you want to put it in Blake's terms. To us, they look like bad things, but that's just a matter of where we stand.
They're too much for you, the human observer.
They're too much for you. They're not too much for...
But they're not too much for God. Or
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
But, this is also true of human monsters. And
I think that's a very Jobian, I don't know if Jobian is a word, but a very Job-related insight, right? This is, in fact, maybe...
Well, it's similar to the
drawing
bit in Job
from
where
perhaps.
He shows him
creation in all its glory and all its terror.
Yeah.
And all its sort of like strangeness as well.
Actually, that reminds me. Isn't there another one? It's just a nice, it's a nice one that just kind of mocks religious conservatism a little bit, but also says a similar thing in some ways. But I like this one too. The pride of the peacock is the glory of God. The lust of the goat is the bounty of God.
Yes.
The wrath of the lion is the wisdom of God. The nakedness of woman is the work of God.
Yes, I love that as well. Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is very kind of just simple in a way, and just kind of just states his outlook on things.
Well, we don't celebrate the lust of the goat.
We don't celebrate.
I mean, these days maybe
Satanists might.
Satanists. Yeah. No, I think they actually kind of
nowadays they maybe not.
I think they sterilize it a bit too much.
Yeah. One thought fills immensity. This is another one I've put a question mark by. What the hell does that mean? One thought fills immensity.
To me, that's another interesting psychological insight. I think he's just pointing out how, I mean, to what it makes me think of is like, it seems ahead of its time in that it points out the fact that, I mean, I wonder, is it referring to one thought?
Like one particular thought,
or is it referring to the fact that one thought can be your entire
life
field of perception? No, I mean I take it to mean in the moment, not like
I see what you mean.
A life is
committed to an ideal.
You have like a lodestar. I take it more
in a single moment,
and similar to the bit about the bird. That this little thing, a thought, actually
itself
fills everything when you're in the thought.
Yes.
You know,
it's how you see the entire world. Yeah. Well,
all you see is that.
And all you, or
the
all
thought
you see
actually
thought.
is what you see.
I guess it depends. Exactly how we're interpreting that.
But it's a very interesting one as well.
Because you could take it in a contemplative sense. You're contemplating inwardly a particular thought, and then that fills immensity. That fills all of seemingly to you, subjectively at least.
That's how I took it.
Or perhaps a thought that you see through, like a worldview that you see through, and then everything is interpreted in its. Or what you alluded to before, maybe he's referring to a particular thought. He's saying, "There's."
Well, that's an interesting possibility.
I have a thought. I have a thought that fills immensity.
I guess maybe I could dig up a lot more, but my two kind of takes on it, just reading it and then instantly reacting, were on the one hand is a kind of psychological observation. About what it feels like, how everything gets you have blinders when in the split second when you have a thought. It's everything. But then there's also this kind of mysterious, intriguing, alluring possibility that he's referring to something specifically that he doesn't elaborate on.
I think that the first possibility is more likely, but
I like the other interpretation just for fun.
Because it's seductive. It's like I have this thought, and then you as the reader are like, well, what is that thought? But then you're already engaged in, you're getting closer to this thought that's going to fill immensity.
Well, and it reminds me a little bit of later on where he mentions what does he call it, the Bible of Hell?
Yes.
And how
the Bible of Hell,
we're going to have it whether we like it or not.
Again,
exactly. that's a nice, provocative, alluring little line to,
So much of it is so brilliant. So playful, ironic, but also so fresh for some reason. Like the language is so fresh, the irony is so fresh, the self-awareness is so fresh.
Well, I was thinking, we're lucky that more or less modern English stretches back even much earlier than this. It gives us,
I've noticed that as well reading Blake. It's like I'm doing a level of interpretation, but at the end of the day, there's a level that I'm not worrying about, where I'm worrying about when I'm reading Plato or something like that, which is the translation issue. Because here the words, and it's my language, and it's the language I grew up in and love and think in, and so I already own that, and then the question is just like, what was he doing with it?
And it's also self-consciously not that we're English, I don't know, maybe you're more English than I am, but it's self-consciously English. It's not just that I use this language.
Albion is the primordial man.
Well, he very similar to Tolkien in that respect. And we can talk about that. It comes up, I think, later as well. He has an interestingly and very, I would say, an interesting and again ambiguous and contrary relationship with the Hebrew heritage in the Bible, where he's creating his own mythology, which is kind of very Little England and Jerusalem, this green and pleasant land, and Albion and these other Orc and all these words, which Germanic words. But obviously, he constantly references the prophets and the Hebrew heritage. But there's an interesting tension there. He's not all in one way or the other. But it makes it very enjoyable to read, I find.
Okay, so here's another one that I like. Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. So I didn't write a question mark there. I wrote an exclamation mark because it's just so, I think, deep in a way, and I haven't fully thought it through. But I think that the initial thing I'm thinking of is sort of like it's to do with the contraries thing, obviously, because what we're saying with contraries is that each of the contraries has a truth to it and expresses the reality of reality, or a truth about reality. And I think this goes even further. It's basically saying that anything that you could possibly believe in some way is a reflection of reality, is a reflection of how things are.
Yeah, I also find that one really interesting. There are also a lot of parts where he makes me think of Spinoza, and it seems like in that one, it's like because our mental creations, our creativity, which is so important for him, because we're products of creativity in this telling of cosmology. And then our creative products, it seems like he's saying it's just as real as us. But that's a very strange, like you say, that's a very strange thing to assert.
Our creative products are just as real as us.
Well, just in the sense that creativity is kind of the most real thing in this telling.
It's fundamental. And maybe you could say it's the work of energy or something like that, or it's the productive fruit of energy or something like that.
Because isn't there another one that says something along the lines of like everything that exists was once just imagination?
Something like that.
I should say like imagination and energy are very strongly identified. They're almost interchangeable in this work.
And so I think also maybe it kind of helps us understand how he might have understood his own created mythology, because I think when we think of that, maybe you don't have this experience, but when I think of someone who's created their own mythology, something seems, and obviously this is partly to do with like the biases of culture, but something seems wrong about that. Something seems like, okay, it might be really clever, but is it expressing reality in the same way that an evolved system of mythology over many generations is?
Because you're kind of accepting this argument that the received products of culture are
more true.
They're more true because they've been selected.
But you know, if everything possible to believed is an image of truth, then there's no necessary reason why that should be the case. I mean,
and I think he would actively argue against that kind of, because that's kind of the conservative position, right? We don't fully understand. It would be dangerous to tinker. I think Blake is also evolutionary, but he's emphasizing something else. He's emphasizing something closer to what you see in nature, where there's ruptures and speciation, and it actually proceeds through destruction. You know, the remainder is cast aside, and the valuable new thing,
new starts,
moves. Exactly.
And you could even say, if we are thinking about the sort of evolutionary process, and you know, I don't know if Blake thought about the Bible in these terms or not, but we could see the Bible as being the product of that, very secularly, very like, I think it's a very good argument to make. But you could say, okay, well, we can say, the Bible is very wise. It does shine a light on truth, but maybe what the aspects of the Bible that do that, they were all generated out of somebody's creative mind, somebody's imagination.
He's going to say that later in the book,
right?
And I think he's explicitly arguing that while that might be true, that it obviously culturally it's very important to us, and it's been built up in this way where that's our language, but he doesn't seem to revere the specific language. He uses it because that's the language of his people, of the people, for him. And it's very poetic and beautiful, and it's created by various geniuses, you could say.
Well, I think that's one of the key points, is that to actually see it as being the expression, the flashes of inspiration or the flashes of creation of actual individual geniuses throughout history. rather than sort of something that's the sort of selective process that happens very gradually.
I don't think he accepts the conservative kind of telling that it's been put together in this perfect way where there's no dynamism anymore. There's no active engagement. There's no
and there's
nothing for us to do.
And there's no more world building to do, and there's no more mythology making to do, etc., etc. Which is sort of like like if you want to have a functional, self-contained, organized religion, you do actually have to draw the boundary. But he's saying no, I don't want that. Yeah, he opposes that. Yeah.
And I think we can maybe get to his specific critique of Swedenborg and.
Okay, so the next one I just want to mention, probably don't need to say too much about it. The weak and courage are strong and cunning. So like another.
Okay, I'll let you have that one. That does sound very Nietzschean.
It is extremely Nietzschean.
Yeah.
And it's very pithy, and it's very is very wise. Like it's just extremely wise. And so I don't think we need to really say too much.
No, it's just it's a great line.
Yeah. Here's another one. This is from the following page, plate 10. Exuberance is beauty. Exuberance is beauty. As a statement, very simple statement, has a feel to it. Mm-hmm. What does it actually mean? Exuberance is beauty.
Well, again, it sounds very vitalistic to me. It also sounds very kind of Hellenistic. Mm-hmm. This idea of nature expressing itself fully, being totally identified with the beautiful, with the ideal of beauty.
There is a necessary restraint in beauty, though, especially if we're talking about the Greek ideal.
Yes.
So it's not just we're not talking abstract expressionism here.
No, and actually, as an aside, Blake had strong opinions about art, about painting, visual art. Mm-hmm. He liked clear lines. He liked kind of even classicism, at least in architecture and sculpture. Mm-hmm. I think he really disliked Titian.
Interesting.
Because it's dark and murky.
Exactly.
But on that, I would say I think this is biologically true. Energy equals structure.
Yes.
And this is that's
a slogan from a particular.
No, well, there's I don't know if it is actually, but there's a guy called Ray Peat. People
we can maybe
who's a Blakean coming from biology, and he has a big kind of cult following on the internet. But that's an aside again. But I think that's quite correct. A low energy system can't reproduce itself correctly. It can't create the needed structures. It can't expand. Exuberance naturally should be identified with beauty.
Energy is structure. Just as a principle of life,
or you could say
or being.
Structure inherently requires energy.
Yeah, I think that's
less energy, less structure.
That's a more cautious way of stating it, right? Is that structure requires.
I said energy equals structure. I can't remember the formulation that's current.
I think it is energy is structure, something like that. Yeah. So, but obviously that's a forceful way of putting the point, which we could more cautiously say is that it requires it, and obviously, and we're talking about life, it just naturally produces that. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe cancer is an exception or something like that, but cancer has its own structure. I guess you could say it's just inimical to the organism. Exuberance is beauty.
Yeah, well, I won't comment on that, but But a lot of people would argue that across the board, the lower the energy, if there's blockages, if there's something that's preventing energy from expressing itself, there's aberrance, there's decay, there's perversity, breakdown. So
that's a lack of energy. That's fundamentally a lack of energy.
And that's kind of a vitalistic or you could bioenergetic approach to biology or human health or whatever you want to call it.
Maybe we could circle back to that if we have time, or even perhaps just do a little separate
But
segment.
I don't know, did you have something about the...
Yeah, well, what struck me here, actually, as we were talking about it, exuberance is beauty, and then we talked about the necessary restraint of beauty, is actually Blake's method that he chose, his primary sort of art form, apart from just poetry, I guess, engraving, is actually an incredibly time-consuming, delicate, like, process. Like, it's not... It's the opposite of abstract expressionism. You're not just splashing paint on a canvas. You're actually just sort of, traditionally chiseling away. But for him, you're doing these things and then corroding the metal and so forth. And so it's a tedious process. And so it's amazing that, from energy, and then you funnel it into... It requires a lot of energy. And it requires a lot of energy.
And I suspect that the feeling of engaging in this, which, like you say, it was difficult.
Yeah.
It required a lot of concentration.
Exactly, yeah.
Hyper focus, hyper fixation.
Yeah.
That must have been a kind of demonic experience.
Yes.
And you might have read somewhere, those people that worked in the print shops, they called them printers devils because they were covered in ink. They were black.
Yeah.
And Blake, even though he didn't have to be, was also one of those people because he wanted to be, it's partly part of his kind of egalitarianism, his kind of spiritual identification with these lower classes, but also I think it's an expression of his kind of demonic drive and maybe lust for control over his process.
Yeah, I mean...
definitely lust for control over his process.
Having abundant energy, sometimes it can present as just sort of like, wandering or something chaotic. But a lot of the time, actually what you want to do, actively want to do, is actually constrain yourself and really focus on something particular and really like... It almost invites that self-discipline.
Well, I think if we're taking it biologically like that, it remains correct no matter which way you cut it. Like, like in like attentional disorders or whatever, it's the lack of the neurotransmitter which allows you to focus. So the more of it you have, the more constrained you can be. If you take it away, you can't be constrained. You can't be constrained. Over the place.
Yeah.
So,
So okay. So I think we certainly haven't plumbed the depths of this just 3 words, exuberance is beauty, but I think we've at least touched on the surface.
Well, we probably looked at it from a very particular angle, but I would say that to me, I can't remember if I've mentioned this earlier, but there's something like remarkably biological and kind of, it feels modern in a kind of biological, scientific sense almost in Blake. Yeah, like the way that he describes how he brings things back down to earth in a way.
Yeah. Well, I was just maybe one more thought on this one, right? Health, which we could at least correlate with exuberance or abundance of energy. Health and beauty, like the healthy person is inherently beautiful, and so there's that direct correlation there, or that direct.
Yeah, I don't have much of an impulse to problematize that one. It seems to me to be true.
Okay, here's another one. Improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius. This is another one I feel like McGilchrist either mentioned or he would really want to mention, because this to me is exactly this whole left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing. Like the left hemisphere will fix the roads and make everything straight. But they'll be, no one will like them. They won't be enjoyable. And then the roads that have character, roads or whatever you're talking about, that have character and that are interesting and that are beautiful, they'll be crooked. They'll not follow the dictates of reason. There'll be something organic. There'll be something natural about them. That seems to be what he's saying there.
Yeah, and I think it's also saying... something about improvement
yes,
and genius are 2 different things.
Yes,
the genius doesn't improve.
Yes,
the genius
creates
something gratis,
something that doesn't necessarily fit,
something that goes beyond it. Might not be useful to, people might not think
it might not be useful. It may even be destructive.
It may be destructive. Exactly. And I think that notion is reflected again and again. Like, for example, love and moral instruction just have no relation. He sees that as a mistake.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so that for me was all the proverbs I've noted. Was there any others you wanted to have a look at?
I think that's a pretty good review. I did, when we were talking earlier, I did want to say that caterpillars don't lay eggs, but or I don't think they do. I'm 99% sure.
Yeah. Do you want to read that one out?
Yeah, if I can find it. And I mean, it's a nice one. I guess it shows.
If you can't find it, I think that basically
Your paraphrase. Yeah, he says, just like the caterpillar finds the fairest leaf to lay its eggs on, so the priest finds the fairest joys to put his curses on.
Yeah. Which I commented was, again, another extremely Nietzschean kind of little proverb.
Yeah. But I think there's one other thing we could say about that one. I mean,
say the main thing first, which is about the caterpillar.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a stretch, but I wondered if there's an intentional weirdness. This is kind of an aesthetic comment. Often there's something awkward and uneasy, and this might be a very minimal thing to pick on, but I'm pretty sure caterpillars don't lay eggs. It's the butterfly that does. The caterpillar is like the earlier stage, but
the caterpillar isn't.
So there's that. I wonder if he injects little bits of weirdness like that.
But
it's quite possible.
It's like the worm that flies.
Yeah, but he lived in London. I don't know if he was seeing that many caterpillars. But then on the other hand, I think it is worth maybe pointing out that it again shows that he's not just talking about how we need to remove these moral strictures because they constrain the good genius or something that maybe religious people actually want but they don't know how to get to.
Yes.
If he says that the priest curses
the fairest
joys, he seems to be saying that the things that we conventionally think of as vices are joys and and are fair and maybe they're good, maybe they're good to indulge in.
Yes. I mean that is the obvious.
Yeah. Just to be clear that he's definitely not. He's not just accepting these things. He seems to be celebrating them.
There's an automatic tendency, I think, for people who are sympathetic with people like Blake and maybe like Nietzsche or people that are a bit more provocative and have maybe this more kind of holistic view of the world, to sort of say, okay, but ultimately this all works out for the good.
Yes.
And basically what they're saying is they're just emphasizing an important aspect that's overlooked that we actually need for the sake of the good. But what you're pointing out is actually no.
He's not for the good, or if you want to use that terminology of the good, his version of the good is radically different from anything you're going to want to.
It's something you can summarize as energy, just like for Nietzsche it's will to power, and it actually is will to power. And will to power, yes, it includes what we would call like productions of genius, which are good, but it also includes like very nefarious things as well. And it's not like Nietzsche was oblivious to that. And as you're pointing out with Blake's not oblivious to that either. He's saying, this is the case. This is what's going on. Okay, so let's. Oh, did you have any more proverbs you wanted to?
I think that's enough. We can always have a little look at the end if there's something missed.
Okay, so let's move on to I think plate 11. So this is the next little bit, and this kind of just talks about the genesis of religion. Basically, I won't go over it, but what I guess maybe the ending could be significant.
Can you? What's this? What's the section called?
It doesn't really have a title, but it starts, the ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses.
I quite like this one.
And it kind of outlines that process and how priests take over and then they sort of regularize it and they, take ownership of it, and that's how you get religion.
Yes.
And basically what he's saying is, it's the imagination of man that creates these beings, but he's not saying it in a reductive materialist sense. He's not saying that, okay, therefore religion is just, or let's not say religion, but let's say what would you say, numinous or something like that is just complete nonsense. He's saying that's fundamentally good. What's bad about it is the way it's taken over by an authority and organized and rationalized.
Well, I think he's ambiguous about the actual historic individuals that play their parts in this too, because he mixes up in different ways the poetic geniuses, which he might often kind of have something good to say about with these kind of manipulators, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
And it kind of relates to that proverb as well about the, weak in courage is strong in cunning.
Yes.
It's like there
Yes.
are classes of people who know how to come in, and that's kind of a genuine expression of their
particular
of their will, of their
or the energy or whatever. Yeah. But I think one of the key things from this is that people have this natural tendency to populate the world around them with like living agencies or something like that, and then at the end, and I think this is the part that I highlighted at least. So after outlining this whole process of the generation of religion, he says, "Thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast."
Yes.
So I mean,
well, again, that's what I wanted to kind of draw out when I mentioned that his argument is ambiguous when it comes to like the material world and the he wants to be non-dualist in this, but that would be quite offensive potentially to a conventionally religious person.
Yes, certainly.
I mean, it's
very provocative to that position. Yeah,
it's a pretty straightforward statement.
Yeah,
and he says when he describes the way that God or that energy works, he's quite clear that it only works through real physical material living beings.
Yes. Yeah.
In his view.
Through real physical material living beings. Yeah.
There's really not that much magic in this.
Yeah.
If any.
But would you say there's a certain degree of panpsychism or something, like in the sense that those rocks and stones that we animated with, or trees or whatever, rivers that we animated with, but they are also expressions of energy. They're also living. Would you go as far as to attribute that to him, or is it a bit ambiguous, or what do you think?
Again, I think it's ambiguous. I mean, what was it that we read earlier? That's about the products of imagination, their reality. Yeah, it's open-ended. On the one hand, he's quite clear that things work in the way you would expect them to. Yeah. At least we would. Modern, people bathed in materialism. Yeah. But on the other hand, he asserts the reality of the imaginary, essentially.
Yeah, so and I think that's what the meaning of the reality of the imaginary is. That's kind of the open question. Yes. Like, how far does that go? Yeah. And if we're products of imagination, whatever that means, like if we're products of imagination, that raises some questions because we seem pretty real. Yeah. And also, you could also argue that the river, the stone, the tree, as we see them as just river, stone, and tree, not with any like gods or anything or nymphs or whatever, they're also products of our imagination. Like, yes. Like, what are they in themselves? They're not the thing that we experience. So, imagination plays a constitutive role right from the
And I mean, I would say perhaps frustratingly, although I'm fine with it. I think it's pretty obvious Blake doesn't care to answer any of these questions.
No, that's not his concern.
That's not his concern.
That's more of an abstract philosophical.
Yeah. And in a way, I think he's an underminer. I think he's trying to. Carve out room for artistic genius, for free expression, for freedom in a very broad, expansive sense. Yes. Political, social, moral. Yes. And he's not trying to come along and create a new system or point anyone in the direction.
And as far as I know, not really claiming to be a philosopher either. So that's just not his thing. Whereas with Nietzsche, for instance, it's more ambiguous because he actually is claiming to be a philosopher, even though his methods and his writing is very unorthodox.
Although to me, I would interpret him as being more in that same mode that I just described, maybe as other people would. More
so, yeah. Okay, so that's that page. I think that the next one is about a dinner that
Yes.
Blake maybe had with with Ezekiel and the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah. Yeah, I actually read that this has been referred to as an example of why Blake was mad or having visions or something like that. And in that commentary, it pointed out that it is titled A Memorable Fancy. It's a fancy. It's not.
Do you remember where you read that, or what?
I think it might have been in this very book here, the commentary part of it.
I think. Well, I mean, I assume that the commentary is referring to relatively contemporaneous suggestions that people made. It seems to me that this idea that he was just mad. I mean, I don't see that anywhere.
I think it also depends on
it seems like slander. I mean,
what you mean by mad. But yes, I would agree. It seems like slander. He seems like he doesn't seem mad in any sense that madness makes you non-functional or something like that.
And there's just so much motivation to
slander him.
Yeah, I mean, like the things that he is saying quite openly got many people hanged.
Exactly.
In his time.
Exactly. Quite openly. I mean, all gods reside in the human, all deities reside in the human breast.
I said to you once in our preliminary conversations, one thing that strikes me about him is he does seem kind of blessed or charmed in a way.
Yes.
The fact that he evaded horrible consequences for his positions.
And in a way that was perhaps due to the perception of him as mad, even if he wasn't mad, right? Because you people can cut him some slack. I mean, this guy's mad.
Well, he carried on his friendship with Tom Paine.
Yeah,
through everything, and
maybe we should touch on some reasons why people did think he was mad. I mean, even by his own account, he had visions.
Yeah.
Even by his own account, he had visions. I believe he saw the devil on a staircase in London. He saw God looking into his window. He saw infinity in a tree or something like that. So there's these incidents that he refers to where he seems to have some kind of supernatural vision or some kind of hallucinatory experience. I mean that's already giving it a certain value judgment or something. So let's just say vision.
Well, I mean, this
seemed to be true. Would you say that's
Sure, but I mean, I think Blake talks about the poetic genius, the kind of visionary artist. I think he was in that mode, and I mean, I'm not that, so I don't know what it feels like.
It actually,
but what I find interesting is yet another contrary, because he's also constantly undermining the mystics of his day and the mystical, the ideas we have about what the mystical experience is,
and the objectivizing.
We're about to get to that. We'll see what he says about what words he puts in the mouths of the prophets.
Yes, exactly.
And what he says about Swedenborg and what he's doing.
And that's what's so modern about him in a way. Like, in a way, he's a little bit like Jung or something.
He cuts through the bullshit, if you see it that way.
Yeah. Because
depending on your perspective.
I'm willing to believe, I don't look too much into it, but I'm willing to believe, he actually had these experiences. Because why not? Because you can take some drugs and you can have similar experiences.
I have no problem
why should he not have those experiences? And maybe he didn't just have a purely materialist, reductive interpretation of them either. But at the same time, it sounds like he had a really healthy level of, I'm not going to create. This isn't the objective. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't the objective system of how the world works.
When you read him, he seems to be.
This is imagination in some way,
right? But he seems to be extremely psychologically sophisticated, given that almost none of that language had really been developed.
Yes. Yeah,
it's stuff that we do associate with Nietzsche, and then obviously with the actual psychoanalysts and things later.
Yes,
he seemed to be comfortable in that mode of thought. Because he's kind of mocking people for drawing spurious conclusions from these experiences.
Yes,
he believes in their reality, but he doesn't take it to mean that he was having conversations with God. Or
yes,
and he makes fun of people who think that they have conversations with God.
Yes, exactly, and take it really seriously and turn it into a system and stuff like that. I agree with you, and that's why, it's so fresh reading him, and to me, it's reminds me of people that I read, sort of in my teenage years, Robert Anton Wilson, people like that.
Well, he fits in that,
and probably had a direct influence, I imagine, on a lot of.
Also, because of course they were popular figures that were that burst onto the culture. I think again, he's a populist, at least in his language and his.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We might have an opportunity to go into this as well, but I think again there's an interesting balance in his populism where there are these extremely aristocratic tendencies as well.
Yeah.
A kind of spiritual aristocracy, perhaps.
Yeah. Is that something you want to talk about now, or is there a place?
Well, I think we're going to come to it as we continue.
Okay. Okay. I guess for me, if we're talking about this Ezekiel Isaiah section, I mean, there's a lot we could say, but maybe in the interest of time, maybe we want to just sort of highlight one or two things. For me, the thing that stood out is the God of Israel is essentially the poetic genius. That's almost explicitly stated that is the monotheism of Israel. That's the poetic genius, the reverence for the poetic genius.
I want to hear what you say about that whole passage, because there seems to be a tension in it that's like very palpable. But anyway,
a tension in it. Maybe you want to say more about that, and that will help me to answer.
Well, let's see. I don't have it in front of me, but let's have a look.
Are we on the right page here? Yes. So I think it's just in that last paragraph there where he talks about it.
Yeah. So he's describing basically the inception and the early history of the Jewish religion, and then they come on to so he says
it will be on the left. Your left,
right. He says that they prophesied that all gods would eventually be found to be tributaries of their god, because poetic genius is like
and then they were
and through their poet king
David.
King David but and then he says he says yes, that's what happened in history, and and from these opinions the vulgar came to think that all nations would at last be subject to the Jews. And then they talk about the power of firm persuasion, the kind of reality in the world of the effects of poetic genius. And I think either Isaiah or Ezekiel mentioned that, in the past these things could move mountains and so forth. But I find, and where are we? And Blake or the Blake character kind of agrees, yes, that seems like that came to be.
Yes.
But I find it interesting where he says, this, said he, like all firm persuasions, is come to pass.
Yes.
For all nations believe the Jews' code and worship the Jews' God. And what greater subjection can be?
Yes.
So that's what I find interesting.
Because it's subjection after all.
Yeah, it's subjection. But
that's a negative
But
thing.
don't you think that's just left ambiguous?
I think you're right.
Because the poetic genius, he seems, and Blake at least, although that doesn't mean we have to accept it, but Blake says, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. You kind of, through your success, you've kind of proved your case. Yeah. But it's a subjection.
It is.
It's oppressive.
Yeah.
It's not an unambiguously good thing that all nations are.
What does Blake the person do? He goes and creates his own mythology, a non-biblical mythology.
Yes.
So it's like, that is, otherwise he doesn't just say, yes, that subjection is good, that mythology is the best one because it takes its inspiration from poetic genius. He goes out and creates a different mythology.
Well, another angle that I find this section very rich. Another angle that seems to be coming into it is he seems to be undermining the idea that poetic genius is the possession of a certain people, or it's in our Bible and it only belongs to our civilization. Yes.
I think at least implicitly, I wouldn't say necessarily explicitly, because obviously on the surface the argument is sort of the uniqueness of the Jews, but I think implicitly, because as an informed reader you can actually say, well, what do the other cultures believe about their gods, and how did they generate their sacred texts? Well, and you actually find out that it's poetic genius all around.
There's just also the interesting there's just also the interesting bit where he goes into those personal questions, if you want to put it that way, where he says, I also asked Isaiah what made him go naked and barefoot 3 years. Yes. He answered, the same that made our friend Diogenes the Grecian.
I love that. Our friend Diogenes. It's so good.
Well, but then the even odder part that comes next,
Yes.
asking Ezekiel why he ate dung, why he lay so long on his right and left side. And Ezekiel says, it's the same that the North American tribes practice. And, who can refuse his own genius or conscience?
Yeah.
I think he says he did it to kind of raise the consciousness of the people around him, but it's a kind of an irrational activity.
And
but he references the fact that other cultures do the same thing.
Exactly.
There's no uniqueness to the marks of the prophets.
Yes.
There's nothing that this only happened in our culture.
I think that's the implicit argument.
Yes.
But there's the explicit and the implicit, and I think you can make a good case that is Blake's position, especially considering again what he goes and does, which is basically creates his own mythology.
Yes. And also, so he has the his mythology, which kind of transposes the Holy Land onto his land, directly. But he also has America as this other outside thing, which he never went anywhere near. But it's this huge vista of newness and difference. Yeah, it's just a very rich, interesting...
But I think it's also fair to say, or to at least emphasize that, he did like the Bible, and he did like the prophets, and he did gain a lot of inspiration from, certainly did like Jesus. And so we don't want to sort of make him too oppositional, right? Like these were sources of inspiration for him as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
I just think he's intentionally holding it in a very tight tension of am I rejecting this as a kind of stale and something even foreign and imposed, especially because he's such a kind of English patriot at least in a spiritual sense, while also constantly invoking the language and even saying that he finds the argument convincing. Their success must mean something.
But like you say, it results in subjection.
That's very interesting.
I agree. That was a very interesting take on that. Let's skip to plate 14. So this is sort of his apocalypse. So every 2 pages will be that looks right. The ancient tradition of the world be consumed by fire.
In 6,000 years. The
cherub will leave his guard of the tree of life, and Blake says, when he does, the whole creation will be consumed and appear infinite and holy, whereas now it appears finite and corrupt. Also, this will come with an improvement of sensual enjoyment. When you were mentioning this part earlier, this is what I was going to add, was that he explicitly links that to an improvement in sensual enjoyment.
Again, he doesn't allow you to escape from the physical. He doesn't say, and then we'll all be our spirit bodies and we won't, we'll just glory in God and it will be essential enjoyment.
Yes.
I mean, he's also describing kind of the reign of the Antichrist, or
potentially. I mean,
it's the apocalypse, so
everything will be consumed. You'll see infinity, and your sensual enjoyment will be intensified. So that implies actually we still have bodies. We still not only have bodies, but we have the same kind of desires, more or less. We just have the ability to enjoy them more. And so I think there's an interesting question about like what infinity actually means here, because it doesn't seem to me the kind of infinity that eternity is in love with the productions of time. This is an infinity that's not abstract. This is an infinity that's not. It's somehow.
Well, I think. I mean, I think there's something very. Redolent of kind of Eastern religious traditions in a lot of what he says. He seems to be describing an actual practical change in how we perceive things. An ability to see things from the...
You mean a kind of enlightenment? That's what you're
an enlightenment, but in that kind of maybe more sober Buddhist sense even. Like nirvana is samsara is nirvana. Because he keeps making it very practical and very earthy,
absolutely.
Like the sensual enjoyment aspect.
I'm going to add
and
something.
These are stages of kind of these might be stages of enlightenment in an Eastern tradition.
I agree. I'm going to add even more complexity to that, and I'm going to say something else from the East. The Islamic conception of paradise.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah,
like very
absolutely.
sensual, very just non-apologetically sensual.
Yeah.
Just like, man, like...
Well, yeah, he doesn't have any...
He doesn't have hang-ups about that.
Well, he doesn't have shame about heaven or this...
Yeah. It's not some abstract thing up in the sky, so to speak.
But it
even
gets much more real than that. To be frank, especially when you read to the very end, he's quite clearly tying this in with things that are happening in real life.
Right.
He's talking about what will happen,
what
could happen, or what will happen, or what may happen to real people.
Yeah.
And what it's going to be like.
And what it's going to be like.
Yeah. And I think he
the apocalypse is then. The apocalypse is
because
now.
Remember,
for him.
he's living in an age of revolution.
Yes.
All
everything
ancient
is getting
regimes
upended.
are threatened. New nations are coming to the fore. Pleasure, America.
Untold freedoms.
Yep.
Untold. The advancement of science and technology, which he's generally against science in a sense, but the technology that enables us to basically free us from labor and allow us to enjoy the world more. All of these are very positive things. Yeah,
and he again, like in the hymn Jerusalem, where he juxtaposes this spiritual realm, city on the hill thing. Is this somehow existing alongside the dark satanic mills?
Well, yes, I was going to say that would be the rejoinder to what.
And
he
this is
said.
the place. This is where he lives. Yeah. No, but I think he doesn't try and. He's not saying get rid of the one and replace it with the other.
Even here, we have the issue of contraries.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, it's just throughout his entire.
I want to muse for a little bit. Just to tell you what I've been thinking about. Because generally, especially the last portion of my life, I've been very sympathetic and still really am, to be honest, towards traditional religion, and kind of let's say hyper aware of the problems and tensions and chaos that might have been brought about by basically the various revolutions that we've passed through since Blake's era, maybe a little bit before. Not that I would take a strong position or a strong side in that. Obviously, I'm not, at least at the moment, traditionally religious. But just thinking in these terms, thinking about Blake, thinking about the era he was living in, thinking about the more positive aspects of what he's celebrating, it makes me also think of the hippie era in the 60s. In a way, that's kind of what Blake is actually celebrating.
I know you, so I know.
You know me, so I have an allergic aversion to.
Sure, but
this lets me see it in a new light,
I'm glad.
Seeing it through the lens of Blake, right? Actually, there's some stupid things about the hippies, but actually they were having a damn good time. You know what I mean?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
I see. Look,
sometimes they're getting swept up in cults.
Well, look, I have a different.
But there was an abundance of energy. There was an abundance of creativity. Think of the music. All of this stuff. And it was mixed with sensual enjoyment, but obviously, I guess the rejoinder to that was it comes with complications. But again, if we're considering that even Blake's not ignoring that, he's not a simple utopian.
No.
But he's saying we need to be more bold in moving into a new era where we can enjoy more, we can create more, and we can live more.
But I also think he's not trying to split the difference. He's not saying let's go a little further, but not too far.
But not too far. Yeah.
It's a totally different way of looking at it. And if you bring Nietzsche into it, he has the same view. At no point does he say we should go backwards, we should conserve this or that.
And I think
when it's dead, it's dead.
And I think he explicitly says in one or two places, I just don't care.
Yeah.
I do not care what happens. If there are these huge upheavals, I don't care.
See, I understand why those kind of conservative arguments seem very reasonable. But
to the extent that people want stability and, to the people that want peace and,
people want these things, but some people
are
want other
willing
things.
To say,
some people want other things.
Exactly.
It's always a conflict.
Yes.
And I mean, look, because I want to kind of I feel like I'm playing devil's advocate, even
Yeah.
though the guy
Yeah.
that we're reading is totally on board with this.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of, I said before we started, I have
Yeah.
a feeling the majority of people listening to this would be more on the other side of it.
Speak up if you are not on that side. If you're actually all on board with Blake, throw a comment in the comment section.
Well, I think it's easy to, and what I was wanting to say is these kind of conservative arguments.
Yeah.
I mentioned Burke earlier. I think that's
Yeah.
kind of the inception.
Yeah.
It sounds so reasonable.
Yeah.
And then I know you're a big fan of Chesterton.
Yeah.
I think he's a different kind of person, but
Yeah.
in a way he continues with this like reasonableness discourse.
Exactly.
Which,
Yeah.
And look, I appreciate his writing.
Yeah.
But I think in a way it can lull you.
Yeah.
Like.
Reasonableness to this may be a small
Because
qualification, but reasonableness as opposed to rationality. I mean,
Sure.
Chesterton,
Yes,
like
yes.
allowing for the playful, allowing
Yes,
for
yes.
the, but
Yeah.
not too far.
And I'm not arguing against Chesterton.
Yeah.
I'm arguing against the more political.
Yeah.
These arguments, which are very current. Obviously,
Yeah,
this kind of stuff
exactly.
is kind of having a second or third or
Yeah, and a real
wind.
effect on the world as well.
It's having an
Yeah.
effect, but I think there's a kind of cloying, sentimental, manipulative, like eye-rolling, moralistic aspect in a way where it's so easy to point to, like I find it very strange when people who are alive now are weeping about these casualties of these revolutionary outbursts.
Yeah.
When they don't, this is really maybe like what Blake might say if he could.
Yeah.
Like, there's no tears shed for the millions who were ground up.
Yeah.
In the
dark
Industrial
satanic
Revolution, impressed on the ships.
Yeah.
Just the generation after generation of poor who frequently didn't have enough food to eat.
Yeah.
It doesn't strike me as the good Christian, nice, way of looking at it. I just think it's a little bit. I think it's just an easy out. It's delusional, and I think he in a little bit there's more of a direct broadside against social commentary of his time. But I don't find. I guess to sum up, I don't find those conservative arguments for like restraint and no, we went wrong because of Hegel or Voltaire. There's these books like
or Descartes or someone tracing it back to someone.
I don't like this genealogical approach of or cultural Marxism. If only these people don't know who they are, but if only I could go back and just really talk some sense into Adorno or Marcuse. It's like, what are you talking about? I would say about you mentioned the counterculture of the 60s or whatever. I don't see it as being that harmless or good. I think it was a lot of it was violent and destructive and even just stupid, misguided. But there's no going back, and it created the opportunities we have now. So in that sense, we have to affirm it.
And we have to be and there's almost a conservative argument there, right? Like it created the opportunities we have now. Like we should actually be grateful for it. You're trying to sneak in and
no, but my point is just like I'm against this genealogical thing of like, well, do you know how bad the French Revolution was? It doesn't look that impressive. Living, being born in the late 20th century and knowing the tiniest amount of history. I'm not impressed by these revolutions of the 18th century.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway.
So just staying on plate 14, there's a couple of other things I just want to highlight. The first thing is, and we referred to this before, I think, because I just love this, because it's just Blake kind of inserting himself in the text a little bit. This is what he says. So he talks about, he wants to expunge the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul. This is how I shall do this, by printing in the infernal method, by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. So first of all, I mean, it's talking about Blake's method of engraving, I guess, which, as I mentioned before, involved an acid corrosive of the metal plate. And so this was his own sort of unique development in engraving, and it allowed him to create, I believe, to create this particular book as well. So he's referring to himself here, and he's referring to his own work. And there's a lovely arrogance, I think, throughout the work, which you get in other creative geniuses. I think this kind of unashamed arrogance. We get this a little bit later when he talks about he's going to give the Bible of Hell to people whether they like it or not.
Well, I also think it's a reflection of his worldview, because at various times he identifies with the devil or something like this as a kind of, or just as a kind of demon, but he also kind of identifies himself with Messiah.
Yes.
He's not afraid to go there, which of course is something which is in the texts of Christianity. So.
Yes, I mean, we were referring just before I think we began recording to the fact that Jesus is referred to as Lucifer in the Bible. And so I guess the other aspect to that quote is obviously, you could go into the whole idea of corrosives revealing the truth, and you could also say that's what he's doing in these, and to the extent that he's a destroyer, he's corroding through the sort of surfaces, the vein surfaces to get to the truth. But I don't think we need to go too far into that. I want to focus on the next part, which is a really famous part. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. And I might as well read the next part. You referred to this. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his cavern. So obviously the doors of perception was a famous, I think, article or maybe short book written by Aldous Huxley that kind of, in a way, spurred the kind of revolution of psychedelics. Yeah,
it was one of the texts of the kind of counterculture, the 20th century counterculture.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with it or haven't read it, I mean, basically it's that if you take certain substances, you can see reality in a way that's not only different but more true, more fundamental, and essentially infinite. You can experience the infinity and the oneness of all reality. Which is a common religious experience as well. And also from just hearing of Blake's visions and the kind of mystical experiences he had, it seems something that he was very in touch with. So he's not writing sort of abstractly here. He's writing, I think, from personal experience. But is there anything you wanted to comment on about the sort of doors of perception quote?
Just that, again, I mean, I guess you do find similar language in all the kind of, or most of the mystical accounts from the Christian tradition, but it does sound very Eastern as well.
Yeah,
I find that interesting.
From all mystical traditions.
From all mystical, but I mean, it sounds like kind of foundational positions in, say, Buddhism or in, Vedic religion.
Yes, certainly in Vedanta.
Maya, and
Maya,
he's kind of denying
denying
the reality of appearance.
Denying the reality of appearance, but if we link it back to maybe the previous plate.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is he doesn't?
It's not a negative denial. It's infinity expressing itself through, or eternity expressing itself through time, something like that.
Yep.
Infinity expressing itself through finite things. Yeah, that's the way to look at it. And that, to me, by the way, and this is, I guess, just somewhat of an aside, but this is essentially the view of Sri Ramakrishna. So. It's a view that resonates very much with me. I think when people think of Hindu philosophy, they maybe think of the more extreme view of certain Advaita Vedantins of, the world is an illusion.
Yeah.
But there's a more sophisticated view, which is actually that the world is an illusion. The world is God and God's self-expression.
Which is much closer
to Blake, and it's more celebratory of creation.
Yeah. And it's closer to all the vitalist tradition.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's that plate, and then let's see what we've got next. He visits a printing house in hell. I didn't have any notes on that. We can probably skip that, although it's an interesting episode. Did you have any comments on that? It seems like a bit of an allegory. There's the different sort of chambers.
Yeah. So this is quite an unusual segment.
Yes.
I can see why you skipped it, but I
don't want to get bogged down.
I understand.
It's interpreting an allegory, so
right. But I see some of these ones. I was most curious to see what you would say about them because they're the strangest.
Pitch them to me.
Well, I'll just very quickly
Okay.
go over what it says.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in a printing house in hell and saw the method in which knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation. And then he goes on to describe dragon men,
Yeah.
a viper who plays its part, eagle men,
Yeah.
lions of flaming fire, and then just unmade forms, which are nothing that we have in our
Yeah.
normal world. And then it gets to men.
Yeah.
Did you have any thoughts on that part?
None that is unique to me. I did read the commentary that's included in this little edition. And,
See, because I haven't read
Yeah.
anything, maybe
well, what's your interpretation?
I thought, and this might be a little strange, but I just thought that it was a kind of attempt to voice allegorically, or I don't know if that, I couldn't discern like a clear allegorical meaning. I thought it was more a kind of poetic, artistic way to describe his kind of psychology, his psychological thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That was the impression I got. I just, in the image in my mind's eye when I was reading that part was of the kind of chthonic forces in an individual, and how they kind of are these forms which we don't actually have access to.
Yes.
I feel in a lot of places where he's making reference to the unconscious,
Yeah.
the
Interesting.
subconscious.
So that's the caverns.
That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah.
Why are you talking about eagle men, dragon men?
Yeah.
These are imaginary things.
Yeah.
But he's talking about them in the context of the transmission of knowledge.
Yes.
And it made me wonder, is he saying that some portion of knowledge is transmitted but in a way that's buried, where it's kind of symbolic and
Could
mythical?
be some collective unconscious stuff here as
now
well.
you can give me the real interpretation.
Well, I think there's something that, Blake and Jung is another kind of resonance. And I haven't looked into this, so I don't know I know Jung was aware of Blake, but I don't know exactly what he thought of Blake. What's interesting to me is that the four Zoas, which are sort of like Blake's four gods, if you will, but they're also the four principles that make up each man. They can basically be mapped onto, first of all, there's four of
traits,
them. The four of them.
They're
so this goes to
psychological
Jung's,
traits.
the psychological traits.
Yeah.
And there's four of them, so they can be mapped onto Jung's idea of the quaternity, like reality is fundamentally fourfold, but also specifically as psychological traits, what they basically are. We won't go into detail because we'll get bogged down, but basically what they are is thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition, or for Blake, imagination, which I think is fairly close enough to intuition. And so they're basically Jung's four functions of personality, and so it's amazing. And I don't think
it just keeps coming up for me. He seems to be making references to the unconscious. He just seems to have a very sophisticated picture of psychology.
Yes,
the fact that he even can think in terms of psychology in a kind of modern sense.
At those times, absolutely.
But you don't know exactly what it says in the. We don't have to look it up if you don't.
I basically just to do a really high level overview of what the commentary says. That the initial stages are sort of destructive and clearing away the baggage of old forms and old traditions and and then the next part is, I think there's some sort of wind that comes through, like that's the creative imagination. So it sort of moves from necessarily destructive, clearing the cave, to the creative imagination. And
of course, right before men, it's the fiery lions, which usually associates with genius and the spark
and potentially energy as well. Yeah. So it's sort of that idea, which seems convincing to me.
Yeah,
but
that does sound reasonable.
So plate 16, the giants who formed this world into its sensual existence.
Okay. I mentioned earlier that I thought there was a part that reminded me of McGilchrist. It was this part. Yes. Again, very psychological.
So what's your take on that? I mean, we can read specific parts of it, but...
you read what you have there and we'll...
So let's see. I mean, absolutely spot on about McGilchrist. That's what I noted here as well. So basically, I might as well read the... Oh, I've got the quote here on my page. So, actually, I didn't write that particular quote. He divides people into two types of people: the prolific and the devouring.
Yes.
So this is what he says. Thus, one portion of being is the prolific, the other the devouring. To the devourer, it seems as if the producer was in his chains, but it is not so. He only takes portions of existence and fancies that the whole. But the prolific would cease to be prolific unless the devourer as a sea received the excess of his delights. By the way, just as a footnote, that idea of the devourer being the sea receiving the excess of his delights, to me, extremely Nietzschean. Nietzsche says very similar things in Zarathustra.
Well,
it's always about, who's going to receive the excess of my wisdom and my bliss and my...
Well, the other thing that that kept coming to mind for me as well as Georges Bataille.
Yes.
Because his whole system, at least at one point, is an economy of excess.
Yes.
And he sees that as kind of essential to human systems. And maybe just like the nature of reality potentially as well.
Yes. Bataille being perhaps, I don't know much about Bataille, but would it be fair to call him a vitalist, or is he a bit more too deranged to be a vitalist? I don't know.
Well, he's a kind of inverter of
a death worshipping vitalist.
Well, yeah. I don't think you could really say he's a vitalist, because he takes the opposite side. He inverts. He's kind of like an inverted Gnostic, I guess, at least at one point in his career.
Okay, but certainly emphasizes excess.
But he absolutely is influenced by Blake.
Yes.
And
okay, interesting.
Well, you can, he's... I would say he's probably...
I actually read that. I think it was him. It might have been some other French poet or something like that. But I think he threw leaves of Marriage of Heaven and Hell into his mistress's grave. Does that ring any bells?
That's correct. I don't know if it was that book, but
it was specifically
that would make
Marriage
sense.
of Heaven.
But like if you think about literary, artistic advocates of evil in history, those are going to be two of the top ones. Right? But he's right up there. So
true.
Very influenced by Blake, and you can see why at that point as well.
And so maybe we should focus on the McGilchrist element. So
well, you can see why I thought that too.
Oh, absolutely. So the prolific and the devouring. So the devouring is potentially, this is one way to interpret it, the rational mind, the left hemisphere, the hemisphere that wants to analyze, break everything up, and reduce everything to an understandable system.
When I did my kind of first pass, I just broadly took the devouring to be like reason as he uses it, and the prolific to be like genius.
Yes.
It's excessive.
It's creative. It's productive. It's excessive. Absolutely.
Yeah. Whereas the devouring is not excessive.
And this is so interesting. Specifically, what he says is about the devouring but it is not so. He only takes portions of existence and fancies that's the whole, and that's directly McGilchrist's view and what he would say is science's view on what the left hemisphere does. And it's only able to see the specific parts of reality that it's focused on. It has no sense of context.
And I don't know if we read the relevant part, but obviously the way it's described, he's saying it's a psychological. It's like the bicameral mind idea. He's saying that at one point there are these giants. They created the situation, which seems to be talking about like human psyche, and then it got bifurcated. Because I think if we just talk about it, sounds like we're talking about two different kinds of people, literally. But
yes. But that bifurcation too, like this is what he specifically says about it. These two classes of men are always upon earth, and they should be enemies. Whoever tries to reconcile them seeks to destroy existence. And we'll talk about Jesus in a minute, but they should be enemies. Whoever tries to reconcile them seeks to destroy existence. So you would think that maybe if you're coming to this text and you're like, okay, so there are two contraries. I have a bit of this and I have a bit of that. Clearly the most
I need to integrate.
Optimal outcome is to integrate.
No.
But no, that is not what Blake's saying. And so, we could talk about in a minute what Blake might be saying, but if I'm going to take the McGilchrist approach to this, it's precisely this. The fact that we have a bicameral mind, the fact that we have two hemispheres, is for a reason. These things need to be separated. They can't just be merged into each other. There needs to be separation. And McGilchrist emphasizes that basically every creature that we know about has this hemispheric division of its nervous system. And so there seems to be something essential about it. And I found that a striking, very striking.
So there's that, and I think it also works on another level as well, because I mean, I think he stopped short of it, but he talks about Jesus coming with a sword to divide, not to...
Yeah, and to separate the goats and the sheep. So he
yes,
actually...
there's... Well, is that...
That's actually in this part.
That's in, yeah. Well, yeah, again, that's Matthew, right?
I think so, yeah. I think it's in Matthew. Yeah.
So there's that, but I mean, it also works in terms of actual individuals in that it could also be interpreted as saying, like, to try and make the genius reasonable, or to try and make the prolific into the devourer, into the rationalizer, is in itself a kind of sin or aberration.
Yeah.
Or,
they need to be separate. They need to be separate
within yourself, but also...
I want to develop that from the McGilchrist position, which you may not 100% agree with, because it's going back in sort of maybe slightly that more conservative direction.
No, but it's an interesting...
But what I mean by this is that, because like you said, we're not talking... we're potentially not talking about literal classes of people, like these people are only devourers and these people
I think it's quite explicit
that we're talking about something within the human psyche. So while you're looking for that, I'll just keep talking. The thing for me is that, okay, yes, but at the end of the day, what am I to do with this? Am I just going to be torn between the tension of these two impulses that I have, these two different aspects to myself? Have you found it?
Perhaps it does remain more ambiguous than I remembered, but I just take the kind of allegory of the giants forming the central experience and then being partitioned.
Yeah.
It seems to me to
refer to the human mind.
Yeah.
And it could do it. But
I do think it has a double meaning as well, though.
I think there may be an element, and this is just speculation, I guess, but I think there may be an element also of Blake. Actually, there's something to that level of different classes of people, different types of people, because Blake is basically saying, like, I don't have to be like you. I don't want to be like you. Well, I am just a different,
That's the idea I alluded to earlier, where... interestingly, while Blake was, very forthright egalitarian, and he's kind of these expressions of radical tolerance and of identifying with the downtrodden and so forth, there's also constant
aristocratic.
Well, just assertions that we're going to get to the most famous one-liner, which kind of like sums it up. But it seems to me to be saying that. He seems to always assert the rights of the genius to be different, to not be constrained.
Exactly. If I was to develop that McGilchristian kind of point, though, in terms of like, we're not talking about integration as simply like finding some sort of mean between the two, or we can't just mesh them together. And yet, as an individual, I do want to actually find some manageable way to have these two elements of myself be productive together. And, McGilchrist would be totally behind that. The question is how, and I think there's 2 points here. The first is that can we find a way to live, to think, to act, where we have these aspects of ourselves separate, the prolific, the devouring, let's say, the rational and rule-based and moral, and the exuberant and energetic, right? Have them separate, because when we try and combine them in a simple sense, we just pollute them and restrict both of them. And yet also be acting from both of them. So what that looks like to me is something like true virtue, in the sense of like virtue that proceeds from energy, virtue that's creative, but it's still rule bound. Like I've always found it extremely beneficial to give myself rules and follow them. Now, obviously that's a sort of rationalizing tendency, but it's also extremely productive. And if it's animated by creativity, if it's animated by energy, and also if it's sort of like, also you can think about your relations to other people. Like you want to be a certain type of person, and you want to be a certain type of person for other people. There's a really dumb, kind of duty-bound, rationalistic, maybe kind of Kantian perhaps, way to approach that. And then there's something more creative and energetic and, like there's this other kind of virtue which still requires rules, still requires restrictions, still requires expectations that you set for yourself. And so I would see that as something being like you're actually using both of those at the same time. Also, what I've found from my experience too is you kind of just have to unavoidably go through periods where you're actually just predominantly energetic and a little bit chaotic for that reason, and there's negatives to that. And then maybe there's times in your life where you actually need to be pretty restricted and pretty sort of self-disciplined, and there's negatives to that. But you never actually get a feel for each of those, and you never get to harness the benefits of each of those unless you go through it. So there's a tragic, if you want to use that dramatic word, there's a tragic aspect to life where you just have to make errors. You have to experience. This would be going to that excess being,
Sure.
right, the teacher. So that would be my first point, and I'll let you react to that in a minute.
Sure.
My first point would be that, and the second point would be that these two principles have a certain relationship to each other. In McGilchrist's conception of the world, it's not that they are equal. One is more fundamental, primordial than the other, and that is the right hemisphere. In this case, it's the prolific and its energy. So, and we saw that earlier in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, because it's reason that is the circumference or outer limit of energy.
Mm-hmm.
So energy is more primordial, and so energy should be the master of the master and the emissary. The energy should take the lead. And so if you're thinking about how to harmonize, to use that word, harmonize these principles, you're not thinking about how to subjugate energy to reason. You're thinking about how energy might use reason productively. That's basically what you're thinking about. So those would be my two kind of... Would you agree with that broadly, or would you want to push back a little bit on that in some way?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because obviously when you talk about it, you say you're thinking about. So it's as though you can apportion... You can just take energy and deploy it here where you want it.
But it is true that we do that and can do that, right? I mean, is that not true to your experience? We can...
a bit more erratic.
Yeah, you are by nature, I agree.
Well,
so.
but no, that all sounds very reasonable to me.
Okay, yeah.
But I think that's not a concern from the perspective in this. Like he's that Blake,
might not be Blake's position.
Blake is well. I don't think it's even of concern. I don't think Blake is trying to point you in the direction of a fruitful doctrine or even a method for integrating or for. He's attacking the idea that that this energy is reducible to any kind of verbal construct or rule or even moral doctrine,
Yeah, which I totally am behind. Like I totally agree with that.
But you're saying, do I think people should try and
bring that into some productive relationship with, let's say, the other side, which is reason, rules, duties, things like that?
Well, with that, I mean, like when it comes to what I personally think about that, I would follow Nietzsche much more closely in his way of talking about that, which is a little different. It can't actually be fit into this into the Blake framework, but I think the way he would see it is like reason and self-discipline and rationality is just integral to the expression of this kind of like chthonic, uncontainable force, in so much as it expresses itself through an individual.
Because it's already restrained in an individual, do you mean? Like it's got a specific structure?
Well, I think in Nietzsche there's no contradiction between self-discipline and energy.
Yes, because he just looks at...
Well, I mean, for example, like you're going to, if you just expand yourself in a completely dissolute way, it's all going to be over much more quickly. It's all going to be much less of a event than if you can build power, build your energy.
Exactly, that's right.
Even pervert them, even restrain them in ways that make them more aggressive, more powerful, and channel them and so forth. I think there's no contradiction there, but it's still not the same as an attempt to take two principles and balance them in the right proportion.
Because there's a monism there. It's a monism of energy.
Exactly.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
It doesn't. It always. It doesn't take the view that. This is what I was trying to get at. I guess is like I think what you're describing always takes the view that the person is ultimately the center of it.
It's the person that adjudicates.
The person is the adjudicator, but that in effect puts them in the role of reason in the Blakean sense.
Yeah, but potentially.
At least in the way that he's talking about it. That's the way I see it, because I just think he's explicitly including chaos, evil, destruction, excess, self-destruction.
I mean, partly what we're doing is we're kind of combining.
I just don't have a but I guess I would say, like, I'm not telling people go crazy. I don't have a strong position on like how people should do this for themselves, if they even should.
And there's a paradox in even talking about it, because what I'm suggesting is this all has to be actually done by an individual and experienced, and there's no other way to it, because like I just said, like from my experience, it's really been living through different periods of my life where I've been let's say excessively self-disciplined and almost self-cruel, but I have no regrets about that. Like, I'm not trying to condemn myself for my self-condemnation. It's been extremely fruitful, but it's been one-sided. And then there's been other times where I've been much more chaotic, much more sort of freely expressive of energy, and that's also been really great. And what both of those have given me is the capacity to actually do both. That's what I'm talking about, the separation, right? I can actually do both, and I can actually deploy both. Now, probably what you're thinking is, who is the I that's doing the deploying, right?
Well,
there's this.
There's that, but I also, I was also just thinking, like, this is a very kind of, knowing you for a long time. This is a I don't know if typical is the right word, but that sounds negative, but it's not at all. It's just it's a perennial. This is what
I do. I try and harmonize. Is that what you're trying to say?
It's a perennial concern of yours. To intellectualize in that way and to try and figure out that problem.
Yes.
I just have such a different subjective relationship with this stuff.
But let me just clarify this, and then maybe the viewers don't care too much about this because it's like too personal to us. But for me, that experience is. I see exactly what you're saying, yes, because that's how I express it verbally. But I think I've become more and more aware that the rational aspect of it, that's kind of irrelevant. What I'm doing is itself an energetic expression.
I totally understand that. And that's how I see it. That's in my way of looking at things. Yes, that's how I would describe it. But you're turning it in a particular direction, which you put your own emphasis. You have your own nature.
Emphasis. Exactly, I have my own appeals to different phenomena.
I just have a different temperament.
Morality.
Exactly.
I'm much more comfortable using the terminology of morality. I get what you're saying.
For me, I really do feel that order, which I think you're. That kind of structure, which I think you're referring to, arises from the energy. That's how it feels.
Arises from the energy.
I feel like if I'm aligned with that, if I'm unblocked in a sense, allowing it to act through me, things start coming into place more. And that's just my kind of experience of it. And like, if I feel like I'm going off course, I feel like what I have to do is feel that again, if you know what I mean.
That's interesting, and we will move on in a second. So I don't want to bore our listeners.
I can't. I guess I'm not inclined to like intellectualize the minute or discrete steps that I take after that to
me, I would say I like tensions, and I like irreducible tensions. So you've kind of been talking in a monistic way, which is fine. Like the energy knows where to go. But I like tensions, and I like it. I don't like it when people try and collapse tensions. So when I'm trying to harmonize this, I'm still doing this with a sense of there's still tensions, but for there to be tensions, there needs to be multiple principles. There needs to, so that's why I keep coming back to this whole question, which for you isn't so much of a question because it's not. It's not that.
I don't know if I guess we just have different vocabularies as well, which is going to sound really confusing on this, but like, I feel that tension, but I don't see it as a tension of principles.
Yes,
that's
not a tension. I see what you're saying.
It's a tension of like,
it's a tension within
of
energy.
Like, I need to suffer, but I don't want to suffer.
Those
I don't consider those principles. I consider those like
permutations
pathos,
of energy.
sentiment. forks in the road.
Yeah, yeah.
But ones that cannot be collapsed.
Yeah, yeah. No, I different ways of expressing,
yeah.
but perhaps also different ontologies. I don't know. But interesting that we've kind of got those different tendencies.
But to bring it to the conversation
back to Blake,
I think that whole discussion is, it's good because that's very different from receiving, that's very different from having a guru or a messiah or something, or a book that you depend on, and having that lay out a structure of virtue, or like an algorithm which you can follow.
Exactly, which just bypasses that experiential
process,
thing. Absolutely.
And this is, I think we get to it very shortly, but this is the... I find it very amusing, like what he says about Swedenborg. And I mean, I know you don't like this word, but he basically calls him a grifter. he may even acknowledge that he has some kind of... he does.
Yeah.
He may even acknowledge that he has some kind of ability or gift, but he totally denies that whatever he's bringing back is these kind of angelic conversations. He just says this is all stuff that's
the grifting. The grifting outweighs the gift, or something.
Well, no, he's just saying like this is all. This is all both kind of dead and mundane and stale. Yeah. But it's also just all written in books anyway. This isn't what... This isn't what mysticism is. Like,
that sense of grifting is you're just lifting, you're just extrapolating on it.
Well, he's making a career out of
it. Yeah. Okay, let's move on a bit. I mean, we're going to stay on the same page because there's some really rich stuff here. But I guess maybe we could mention a couple of things that might, let's say, confound people. One of them would be, because he says that religion tries to bring these two principles of the prolific and the devouring together, and that's a bad thing, basically. Yeah. Why do you think that is? First of all, why does he identify religion with this? And second of all, why is it a bad thing?
Well, I think it really relates to the kind of tangent that we were just
You need to keep those things separate because...
At least in part. I mean, they're naturally separate. If we're talking about individuals, which I do think is a kind of like double meaning in there. I don't know which meaning is primary exactly. It seems to me the psychological, facets of psyche interpretation is the primary one. But in individuals, obviously... in the Blakean worldview, it would be a disaster to chain and completely constrain the poetic genius, if that's kind of
maybe even partially constrain. I mean, that seems to be what this is suggesting.
In that case, even partially.
Yeah.
When it comes to the individual, maybe his version of psychology just doesn't work in the way that you're kind of like conventionally interpreting it now with the language and the...
But why religion? Why do you see religion, or not you, but why does Blake see religion as being, an attempt to combine these two principles? Is it because
I think he's against codified morality.
Yeah. Okay.
I think he's against morality in the conventional sense, in the religious sense, in the sense that everyone around him more or less would have understood it.
Codified morality,
except maybe Sard. I don't know.
yeah.
But yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's a really succinct way to put it. Like he was just against codified morality.
It seems to be in there. I mean, he's
because what is Jesus doing in this sort of section and in this book? Right. He's basically he's not completely like immoral, but he's just utterly uncodified.
He's amoral. I would say he's amoral in the passage that we're going to get to.
I think Blake says he's virtuous or something like that, but his virtue is pure impulse. Like he's not bound by any...
So leaves open whether that counts as morality in the way that we, it becomes semantics at that point perhaps. But
he's not acting from rules, and he's not acting from sort of reasoned out principles. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a polemic. It's also satirical.
Yes, of course.
It's funny.
Yeah.
It's provocative.
Yeah.
I think Blake is making that argument for the purposes of this book. He's not trying to be like balanced and not get it wrong.
For the purposes of this book, absolutely.
He's making that argument as opposed to this idea that people are receiving these tablets like they used to.
Yeah. He's giving you contraries. And that implies that there might be something also to be said for the other side. And it's up to you as the individual reader to try and work out how they might possibly fit together. At least that's how I would take it.
Sure, but I guess I really think he's someone who would be against the kind of systemization that we were discussing just a moment ago.
Yeah. If we want to take virtue as referring to the way Jesus lived, so maybe take it in a non-moralistic sense, then you could say something like, you can't systematize virtue. Like, that's what religion attempts to do.
Well,
it attempts to systematize virtue. Or you can't systematize love. That might be another way of
and that's certainly in the it's in the text. I mean, in the original text, it's in the New Testament. I mean, if Christ is a child is innocent, but not because they know how to be innocent.
Yeah.
And
a child is innocent but amoral. Like
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And another thing obviously that you see throughout Blake is he's putting humans on the same plane as animals constantly. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand how you can be talking about the lion and the tiger and the lamb and the horse and so on, and then without ever mentioning morality or systemic kind of concept of virtue. I just think he's against that.
I think that
based on what we can see,
the second thing that could confound readers is let me just read the passage. Some will say, "Is not God alone the prolific?" I answer, God only acts and is in existing beings or men.
Well, again, like I said off mic, I think he's clearly, openly out there to problematize any kind of airy-fairy spiritual interpretation.
Transcendent, absolute.
Yeah. He's bringing everything back down to earth. That seems pretty clear.
He's not saying there is no God. He's saying that God only is in actual beings, just like he's saying, I think, that infinity only is in actual beings. Something like that. Like, get rid of your left hemisphere conception of infinity, your left hemisphere conception of God.
Well, he's also, you could say the same when he refers to eternity. He's also saying eternity is in moments. Eternity is in the bird, in the moment of sensuality.
Yes,
and nowhere else.
That's a different kind of eternity than the eternity that we think of through the left hemisphere.
Just like God is in the genius and in the lion and so forth, and nowhere else. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to a really interesting part. This is another memorable fancy. There's several memorable fancies throughout this book. This is the longest memorable fancy and the longest sort of section of the book as well. This is basically where Blake, or whoever the character is, the main character of this sort of book, is taken by an angel to see his eternal fate. Is taken to see a vision of hell. I understand there's a lot of Swedenborgian references in there, even though I haven't read Swedenborg, but that's what I've read. And it's ironic. It's making fun of it. Basically, it's kind of a trip. It's a really
this is where you get some colourful imagery. Very
colourful imagery, somewhat disturbing as well. Some humour in there as well. I'll tell you what I love about it. We can maybe just talk about it. But so there's a couple of moments that I really love. So basically, what happens is he goes through. There's a level of allegory here, like he goes into a stable, a church, a vault, a mill, a cavern. It's all symbolisms. We won't go into the symbolism there, but basically he ends up sort of in the edge of this abyss at the bottom of the earth, and he sees a vision of hell, and the angel says, you're going to spend eternity in this place, sort of the worst part of hell, between the black and white spiders. Symbolism there we won't go into, but then he sees Leviathan rising in the deep, and then I want to read it out because the effect of it is amazing. It's even more amazing when you've read through the whole lengthy story. So after he sees Leviathan, this is what he says: "My friend the angel climbed up from his station into the mill. I remained alone. And then this appearance was no more. But I found myself sitting on a pleasant bank beside a river by moonlight, hearing a harper who sung to the harp, and his theme was, 'The man who never alters his opinion is like standing water, and breeds reptiles of the mind.
Another very memorable line that it always comes to mind for me.
Extremely memorable.
Reptiles of the mind, it's
and
a good...
just brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like, to me, very Robert Anton Wilson, very that
Mm-hmm.
kind of just like, change your paradigm, don't be confined to one sort of reality tunnel, that kind of thing. But the effect of it too, like he's immersed in this kind of spiritual vision, and there's almost like a shrugging off of it. It's just like, no, this is and this is the other part I loved about it. So when the angel comes, so when he goes back and finds the angel, I arose, I sought for the mill, there I found my angel, who surprised asked me how I escaped. I answered, all that we saw was owing to your metaphysics. And then he describes what happened. I love that.
So yeah, you see his perspectivism there as well,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very interesting because it seems to me like he's saying, if we believe this, we're going to instantiate it in our society and in who we are, and how,
exactly,
basically like the world is as it is.
Yes.
And if I were to believe you,
yes,
it would be a curse.
We would
I would ruin the world.
Real,
yeah. But look how easy I can just turn away, even though you're an angel.
I think part of what's so potent about it for me is that I think this isn't particularly intense for me as a person, but I think it's still present. We kind of grow up in mythological worlds. We grow up in belief systems, and they stay with us. And there's maybe a part of us that actually believes in hell and believes in eternal hell. And I think for a lot of people, there is the sense of like, there's a default, like, this is actually real. Like, this is, even though I'm rational, even though I've kind of surpassed this belief, there's something primal that sticks with you. And I feel like what the angel's doing, like at the very start of this story, it's like, there's this guy, Blake, essentially, who's just talking all this shit about, freedom and free expression and free love and so forth. And then this angel comes and sort of reminds him of his heritage.
Well,
like,
he's like the most conventional, but the angel is also a Pharisee, which is interesting.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But, and then plunges him into an experience. That's what's so interesting and psychological about it. It's not that this character is ultimately like completely free of it. It's so potent to him that he gets plunged back into the experience. It's sort of a hallucinatory quality. Yeah. But then the turning point being that, it's sort of like he remembers that actually this is just someone else's metaphysics.
Well, he's showing you how this works.
Yeah.
The angel doesn't come and make the argument for his kind of Christianity, and Blake rejects it because it's illogical or something.
Yes.
The angel shows how by creating this mythos, you can control people.
And that's tapping into the emotional, the real emotional reasons why one might believe or not believe, because essentially this is a threat. This is like, you should fear the afterlife. You will be tormented for eternity.
And I think I would say, especially in light of what comes next, there's a where the angel is showing their fate. I think there's also a very secular layer to this, where he's talking about how belief in the kind of social strictures and mechanisms, he's kind of calling them like spooks in a sense, like by believing in them, we're recreating them. Yeah. I just think that the particular nature of the vision, the next vision seems to me to be very much a secular critique of.
I'd like to hear what you think about the next vision. I'll just say a few words about it first to sort of introduce it. So the next vision is also quite disturbing, in a way more disturbing than the vision of hell that we've had. Basically what happens is Blake, or the writer, whoever's telling the story, goes to the angel and forcibly takes him by force and says, well, I'm going to show you your eternal destiny. You come with me. And then where they end up is in this sort of place where basically there's all these chained monkeys, or simian creatures of some kind, snatching and grinning at each other. They're withheld from each other, from actually grappling each other, but every now and again they'll come into each other's grasp, and then they'll tear each other to pieces basically and eat each other alive. And It's horrific. By the way, they get there by diving into a Bible.
Yeah, I like that. I like that bit.
So there's that. And then I want to hear your opinion on what the symbolism means in a second, but I also wanted to just link what I was saying before about, this is all your own metaphysics to what happens at the end of this vision. So this is what the angel says after seeing all of this. The angel said, "Thy fantasy has imposed upon me, and thou oughtest to be ashamed."
Yeah.
And then I answered, "We impose on one another, and it is but lost time to converse with you whose works are only analytics." That part's not so important, but I love this part. We impose on one another.
Yes.
Like, there's again something very Nietzschean about that.
And I think it also relates back to our little aside about, how to approach this in terms of, how much reverence should we have for our tradition, or is there validity to Blake's politics and stuff?
Yeah.
I think he was he was quite realistic in that sense. Like he says, it's a fight.
It's a fight.
Yeah,
it's a fight. And
also obviously it reflects, when he says that, it actually reflects the nature of the images that are conjured in the vision.
Yes, which is a constant fight. So tell me about that. What's the symbolism of the vision?
That one to me just seems, I'm thinking in Blake's time when it's like the real, rise of political economy, and then a little bit later, Malthus would come and so on, but you had Adam Smith and everything. It makes me think of that term useless eaters, this idea of, in the Dark Satanic Mills thing, everyone chained, everyone is in this kind of zero-sum game, consuming each other for eternity.
So he's saying this is where your principles lead.
Yeah,
this is
and it just to me sounds like he's associating the principles of status quo religion with these new politico-economic kind of strictures that are being put on on the English, say, on humanity.
It's a very left-wing argument, basically what you've made there, which is sort
that's
of
what it sounds like to me. And also remember, this is a time when people were becoming exorbitantly wealthy of the transatlantic slave trade, which he was very aware of. Abolitionism was rising.
He's basically, what you're suggesting is he's basically pointing out the alliance between like conservative religion and the new the new rising order of capitalism or something like that.
Yeah, and I think he's just kind of saying that following down your path isn't. This is hell on earth, essentially.
This is hell on earth. Yeah.
There's nothing liberatory in it.
I hadn't actually seen it through that specific lens.
It's just the imagery of the chained monkeys to me seems so much to be talking about factories and slavery. And
potentially, slavery, and maybe just the economy of capitalism or something like that. Yeah.
And just to add to that, there's that, and there's also, the kind of social economy, or this intricate system of status that they had, which wasn't 100% identifiable with money, maybe at that point. This was a very front and center thing, obviously, for the English, especially around that time. There's also that element, imagine people ripping each other apart over slights and faux pas, and that's where that kind of constrained thinking leads.
A few other points about that, and partly this is again from the commentary a little bit. These simian creatures are essentially devourers, so we're referring back to sort of the devourer versus the prolific. So you could actually just see this as being reason itself, or something like rationality itself, just constantly. Especially because he finds Aristotle's analytics.
That's the other aspect that made me think of political economy and everything. It seems like he's saying this is the end point of mechanistic thinking. Yes. This is where everybody becomes a rational unit.
Yes.
And sees that it's in their interest to destroy each other.
Yes.
Whereas I think it's in the Proverbs of Hell, he says that the most sublime act is to put someone before you. It's the very inversion of the logic of capitalism, the logic of polite society, maybe even.
Yeah. And then There was also a comment in the commentary about that this could represent like the religions basically, just warring and so forth. And then at the bottom of the page there's a depiction of Leviathan, and in some versions it's more clear, in some versions less clear, and here it's not very clear at all. But there's the phrase "opposition is true friendship." So again, it's lovely, especially after that story of this opposition or these contraries of the angel and Blake or whatever, and then it's like. Well, and reminding you that the necessity of these two different,
and they end on a
equal footing in a way.
It's not a conciliatory note, but it's a tolerant note.
There's a mutual understanding.
Yeah.
It's like I impose on you, you impose on me.
And actually, it's probably a good point to say. It's interesting for me in Blake. He kind of has these like proto-socialist, egalitarian, like ultra-liberal positions, but at the same time. He's always an advocate of multiplicity, of not trying to force everything into the one mold, whether it be morality, politics. He's for frisson and kind of escape and conflict.
And I love that. And I love that he can put something like that, in this case after, but it's also throughout the story, right? Like throughout the story where basically he's clearly one character and he clearly has a specific position, and the angel's clearly, like, at least as they're portrayed here, like kind of stupid and kind of naive and kind of like bad, but
they're really close to the Pharisees in the Bible.
They're close to the Pharisees.
They're like accusers who know the way things are supposed to be.
But there's a self-awareness and a comprehensiveness and a holistic quality to be able to say, opposition is friendship, and to say we impose on each other. Like, and no one is on a, like... He
even befriends them. Converts them, to devilry.
There's the angel that becomes the devil. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so let's see. Where can we go from here? I think maybe you wanted to say some comments about... this is plate 21. You could write maybe I got this wrong, but you could create 10,000 volumes from Paracelsus or Burma, infinite volumes from Dante or Shakespeare. Was there somewhere before that you were sort of alluding to this, or maybe I imagined it?
Yeah, I guess just in relation.
Maybe I was thinking of Swedenborg. I think
it was. It's just when it came up.
Because I didn't care about Swedenborg.
I also. I mean, it's unless obviously neither of us.
Yeah.
But I think I guess I'm just accepting Blake's slander, but I do think he's kind of describing something like the modern phenomenon of grifting, where this guy is repackaging. He's repackaging something that doesn't pose any kind of threat. It has no vitality. It doesn't add anything to the conversation. It's just I don't know. I think it's just
there's no genuine creativity there. Basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but I think.
But there's a profit being made of it, or something like that.
There's that, but I think it's also interesting that he's pretty explicit that, like, this isn't what happens. You don't have conversations with God or with angels and then bring this back. Like, I can I can work backwards. I don't even have to know. I don't have to have access to your...
This is a rationalistic process. I can see it on the page.
I can see it on the page. And it's, it kind of relates to when he's having the discussion with the prophets, and they I think we might have breezed over that one point that they make, but I think Ezekiel says I didn't talk to God. Not in the way that people are saying I did. I felt righteous indignation at like the people suffering, and that was and to me that seemed like that seems like God. That was
the voice of God.
That is the voice of God.
Yeah,
to express your righteous suffering forthrighly.
Yeah,
to just speak your mind. Yeah, without fear.
Yeah.
And if that makes me a prophet,
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting juxtaposition with someone who brings back these very nice principles, conventional. Couldn't go, they'll help you. It's like self-help. Like, we're getting away from Christianity.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing in this is, my understanding is Blake was drawn to Swedenborg, and he was maybe not an outright disciple.
At least initially he was.
But interested in what he was doing. But Swedenborg, I'll just quickly go over this, but it seems like Swedenborg's grift, if you will allow me to call it that, was...
We're slandering someone we haven't read, just for clarity.
No, I don't take it that seriously. It's
okay.
It's just that, to me, it seems like what he's saying is we can dispense with theology. We can dispense with, you know, like going to church and reading these books and so on and so forth. I'll just give you the information direct, you know.
Yeah.
Like direct, subscribe to my Substack. I'll just tell you it. We'll bypass, you know, bypass the authorities. Seems to me very similar to the kind of argument that people make now in these kind of like intellectual subcultures of like, they don't want you to know this, but then it turns out the thing that they don't want you to know is just conventional information, knowledge. Right. Because it's not that, you know, Swedenborg isn't an advocate for the church or anything like that. He's saying like, I'm getting it direct. I'm getting it direct. Mystical experiences. But
the content is
to me,
sort
it's
of
just very
synthesized out of everything that's already come.
And it's measured to be as inoffensive and non-threatening as possible. I don't know.
Without just being sheer orthodoxy or something like that.
Just enough to pique your interest. I just think there's a lot of that in the world. Anyway.
For the record, I think that the word grifter is overused as a term of abuse and is often just used to criticize your opponents. But that's my position. Kay knows this, so we have a bit of a difference there. Let's see. So where are we going to next? I think we're going to potentially the fifth memorable fancy. So this would be plate 22. What is this memorable fancy about? Obviously, I don't remember. Oh, yes. A devil in a flame of fire.
This is a pretty good one.
The devil in the flame of fire, the commentary informs me, is basically Blake himself. Okay, let me read a quote from this. The worship of God is honouring his gifts in other men, each according to his genius, and loving the greatest men best. I won't mention who that sounds like.
Well, it's just very it's very classical as well.
Yes, that's
very Greek.
It's very classical. It's very classical. Those who envy or calumniate great men hate God, for there is no other God.
I love
is
that.
Something that sets the angel off. Yeah.
It turns them blue, right?
It turns them multiple colors, multiple stages of color.
I mean, I think that's great. I think that's a pretty clear example of where he diverges from, what we're familiar with in religion.
And then the angel sort of comes back at him and sort of says, "What about Jesus?" Jesus actually affirmed the Ten Commandments, and this was a really fascinating part for me, because what Blake actually says is that eventually he says no virtue can exist without breaking these 10 commandments. And he kind of gives a list. Some of them I think are a little more specious than others, but I think the general principle is
it's a provocation.
It's a provocation. So basically what he says is, if Jesus Christ is the greatest man, first of all he says, if Jesus Christ is the greatest man, you ought to love him in the greatest degree. So he's automatically just pushing against the sense of, okay, everyone's equal. But if everyone's equal, this man that you hold is so great, you actually love him because of your.
Well, but he's also creating a very presumably unusual to his less sympathetic readers, a very unusual value system.
Yes.
Very unusual way of figuring out
yes.
how to engage.
Yes. So anyway, this is the key point. He says, now hear how he has given his sanction to the law of the Ten Commandments. Did he not mock at the Sabbath and so mock the Sabbath's God? Murder those who were murdered because of him? That's the one I think is a little bit specious, but anyway.
I agree with that one.
Yeah. Turn away the law from the woman taken in adultery. Steal the labor of others to support him. Bear false witness when he admitted making a defense before Pilate. Very interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
Covet when he prayed for his disciples and when he bid them shake off the dust of their feet against such as refused to lodge them. So, and I think the overall principle here is quite true. Like, yeah, Jesus' approach was very much like well, first of all, Jesus' explicit approach, this wouldn't even be controversial to Christians, was obviously above and beyond the law as it's written. But I think what Blake's pointing to here is even more provocative and controversial, which is actually like a certain amount of vice is actually essential and necessary.
He was an antinomian. His method was tied up with breaking the law.
Necessarily needed vice and included vice.
I mean, I would just...
If you want to call it vice.
I would happily defend the murder one as well. I mean, I think it also relates back to his other positions, like Blake's. If you want to change things, if you want to engage in revolutionary action, whether it's spiritual or whatever it is,
people are going to
inevitably,
die.
and you
if it's your
you take that
followers or
upon
their
yourself.
followers,
There's no progress without murder.
Yeah.
There's no like passive
There's
magical
no progress without murder. That's
You
going to
heard
be
it-
a
you heard it here
quote.
first.
That's going to be a quote from the.
Well, there's no like magical raising of consciousness.
Yes.
He's totally railing against all that kind of
Right.
Because
Yeah.
that's kind of, I guess, what the people that he's writing this against. They're kind of like proto New Age, I guess, maybe.
I see. It can all be done peacefully. It can all be just.
If we all just bypass these nasty aspects of
Yeah. Okay, and another great quote. Jesus was all virtue and acted from impulse, not from rules.
Yeah,
so
I
that's
love
what I was
that.
referring to before. He does say Jesus was all virtue, and so that maybe raises some questions about what virtue is specifically as a concept for Blake. But yeah, I think
it makes it hard to fit it into. It makes it hard to recapture it and fit it into anything we recognize, because he's saying he's all virtue.
Yeah.
We don't really have
What
a
does
way of
that
talking
mean?
about
Yeah.
virtue where there's no negative space.
And then immediately says, and acted from impulse, which
Yeah.
again is very much usually contrasted with virtue, to a certain extent, although
I-
virtue is
again,
also
I
bound up with
I think it's
being automatic in an Aristotelian sense.
To me it sounds very Greek.
Okay, and then we've got some lovely lines on page, plate 24, about the Bible of Hell. So there's a couple of things to note here. So first of all, the angel he's talking to has now become a devil and is my particular friend. So that's just lovely. I love that. We often read the Bible together in its infernal or diabolical sense, which he's kind of done. He's already been doing some biblical interpretation in an infernal sense, which you don't actually get much of, because generally if you're talking to Satanists, they won't be like interpreting the Bible. They'll be,
it's
overthrowing
like
the Bible.
earlier implies this happens accidentally because the great poets by nature of the devil's Milton does it without meaning to. But
so to the extent that the Bible is written by
Blake
great
is an
poets and
active-
great geniuses, which it is, then they're automatically of the devil's party, even if they think otherwise. And so there's a way that the Bible automatically undermines itself. And it's infernal.
Well, it's just more
diabolical
complex
sense.
than...
Yeah, it's more complex, which the world shall have if they behave well.
Yeah.
Lovely. So that's the biblical interpretation. I have also the Bible of Hell, which the world shall have whether they will or no.
Yeah.
And so arguably that's, at least this is what the commentary suggests, that is Blake's prophetic works. That's his mythos that he creates and all his strange esoteric poetry, and this is actually what he goes on to develop. Also, one more note on this page, because I just noticed it. There's a depiction of possibly Nebuchadnezzar turned into an animal or thinking he's a beast. And at the bottom it says, "One law for the lion and ox is oppression."
Yeah,
so,
great little...
a lovely. This is maybe the non-egalitarian Blake. This is the more aristocratic Blake.
Yeah, again, I can't remember if we discussed this on mic or off mic, but I think he was a political egalitarian. He was someone who just allowed himself freely to express his compassion for the poor, but in that other sense, he always advocated for multiplicity, for difference, even for hierarchy, but
in a certain
spiritual
hierarchy, natural hierarchy
of energies.
Yeah, hierarchy of energies, exactly. Okay, so we're pretty much almost at the end now. I think we've got, so what have we got? We've got plate 24, Bible of Hell.
Well, this is where it seems to get political again.
Of course. So we're on to the Song of Liberty. So obviously political just by very nature. So it ends with, I think, a few pages of the Song of Liberty. The eternal female groaned. It was heard over all the earth. Albion's coast is sick, silent, and American meadows faint. And so on and so forth. So it's somewhat allegorical. But essentially it's referring to the revolutions that are beginning to sweep the world.
Yeah.
Also, what I found quite interesting is he just refers to, if not in this song, it might be in the opening song, but he just refers to the newborn terror.
Yeah.
And also the newborn fire. And so, again, it would be interesting to know at what stage the French Revolution was in, and whether the term terror was being used, but he's openly using it in a positive way. The newborn terror is something good for Blake. This is the revolutionary spirit.
Yes. He is referring directly to
the French terror. Interesting.
Well, and it was a terror. This is the thing. This kind of relates to when we were talking about that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
It was the worst thing to ever happen before anyone had even really been harmed.
Yes.
From the perspective of the stasis of society, the powers that be at the time, they were like,
yes,
they had whipped it up into being the worst possible thing.
Yes. But then,
before it happened, essentially,
and it also did become a genuine bloodbath for ordinary people. Yeah.
But even at the time, if you took the other perspective, not the kind of official propaganda one, millions of people were sympathetic.
Yes,
millions of people, even later, wanted Napoleon to invade England. I mean, especially Ireland.
Yeah.
But so there's a balance there.
Yeah.
I think there's a playfulness there, but also a hardness.
Yeah,
that's that Blakean kind of devilry.
Yeah,
he's not afraid of celebrating the terror.
Yeah. And then, we get the lines, "Empire is no more, and now the lion and wolf shall cease." And then I think those also were somewhere else in this book as well. And then at the very end, I think it's the very end. Yes, it's the very last line. Beautiful. For everything that lives is holy. Yeah. This also reminds me of Ginsberg's poem, and I think that Hell, this is part of it where he just repeats like, holy is this, holy is that, holy is, and ordinary everyday things. And I think Ginsberg and I think the Beats in general were actually tremendously inspired by Blake. But I mean, that's a great way to end it. Everything that lives is holy. And so, I mean, there's your vitalism, but there's also that sort of religiosity in a very unique way, but certainly a numinosity or religiosity or spirituality that maybe separates, at least in rhetoric, separates Blake from someone a bit more like Nietzsche or someone who's more...
well, maybe in one of his other moods.
Yeah. Well, the whole Zarathustra thing is very spiritual in a way, but
and it does say everything that lives is holy.
That's true.
It doesn't say all the things that perished were holy.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure that's
I mean, everything that lives is holy. So that immanence, there's that real immanence there as well. And there's also a transcendence, as we've referred to, the infinite, the eternal, but it's a transcendence that isn't abstract. It's a transcendence that almost can be touched, that almost can be seen.
Well, yes, it is also in the body.
Yes.
And in the world, the physical world.
Yes. And if we wanted to be more conciliatory to Christianity, we could say, actually, these are Christian themes. Like, God is Christ, God is man, God is touchable, God is eatable, digestible.
Yeah, the heterodox themes that go back to the early church and the earliest. But I think Blake invents a new language.
He does, yeah.
And he takes it further than someone who's just trying to give their interpretation of Christianity.
Yeah.
He's
the antinomian. That's the real key. Yeah.
Yes.
And so he's doing something in a way, to the extent that he is actually taking on board Christian mythology, is revering Christ. He's doing something sort of like the kind of radical Protestant antinomian sects.
Yes, just taking it much further.
But taking it even further potentially.
And he's preceding so many modern tendencies, movements,
absolutely,
sentiments.
And I referred to the hippie kind of revolution before, and you could say that he's the real progenitor of that.
There's a lot of that
before. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end. Did you have any final thoughts on the book?
I think we covered it pretty thoroughly.
I think if we wanted to cover it truly thoroughly, we'd be spending many hours. But
well, I mean, in terms of a personal read through and take and our feelings, I think that was a good.
I mean, my experience of reading it was one of really feeling the energy of it and the inspiration of it, and sort of connecting with that side of myself as well.
Well, like I've said, I always have some of those lines from this and from other works like in my head.
Yeah.
But it's quite cool actually discussing it. It's a whole different. And that's I like that that's a theme through all of Blake as well,
Mhm.
which again you could say is maybe a very Nietzschean theme, but also universal.
Mhm.
You know, like that opposition is true friendship.
Yes, yes.
It's
a
cool.
very profound theme,
Yeah.
and it's not obviously unique to these particular thinkers like Blake, Nietzsche. It's actually ancient. Like, it's actually, it's a Hermetic dictum.
Yes,
It's
yes.
like, it's probably as ancient as you can be. But
it does stand in opposition to other
Mm,
ideas, because
Yes.
there are other relations which can be elevated.
yes,
But it's like for Blake, that is our
yes,
reality. Like in the proverb where he says, "The bird a nest, the spider a web,
yeah.
man,
Man
friendship."
friendship, yeah.
That is our proper
that is
relation.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So cool to discuss, Blake with another person.
Yeah, and it's made me really want to read more Blake as well, like the poems, which I've read several of before. But I think that your perspective on them as being, that saccharine simple quality, actually seeing that in a new light and seeing that as being a little bit intentional, but
I think it's honest, and it's true, and he had those.
Yeah.
He had that kind of childlike capacity and innocence.
Yeah.
But I think it is also not knowing, and that's his point, basically, that like innocence and experience interpenetrate. There's no innocence without experience, and there's no experience without innocence.
Yes, and conveying that in poetic form, in the very form and the very language of the poems. So that's the poetry. Well, all of it is poetry in a way,
but the aesthetics
that's
are
the
really
conventional poetry that's
Yes.
not infused with his mythology. And then I definitely want to read more of his mythological sort of prophetic works.
But yeah, it is interesting. These things have wormed themselves into culture to such an extent,
Yes.
especially for English.
Yes, of course.
British English people.
Yeah.
We're
in Blake's subjection to Blake.
Yeah, well, the hymns and the poems, but
Yeah.
but whether they're taken in anything like the way
he
would have
intended,
them.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
But he's a beguiling figure like that. He's
Yeah.
a kind of tricky, playful figure. In some ways.
Yeah, and those are some of the most interesting and creative figures.
Mm.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been
Thank you.
a
Yeah.
wonderful talk.
Yeah, great discussion.